I once thought I had seen the full extent of human cruelty after 31 years on the federal bench. I was wrong. It all began with a phone call at 6:47 in the morning. On the other end of the line was the sound of my daughter Claire sobbing uncontrollably. Through choking tears, Claire said I was in an accident, Dad. My husband pushed me. I lost the baby. It felt as though the world collapsed beneath my feet. The coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered across the floor. My grandchild was only 7 months old in the womb. The poor child never even had the chance to see the sunlight. My Claire was lying in a hospital bed suffering. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, make yourself comfortable, and remember this: the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose otherwise. Leave a number 1 in the comments so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. That morning in Asheville was strangely peaceful. Mist still drifted among the old pine trees. I was sitting on the porch with a hot cup of coffee. Life as a retired judge was supposed to pass quietly like that. But then the phone began ringing relentlessly. The sound shattered the silence. It signaled the arrival of a terrible storm. The shock quickly transformed into a burning fury. But it was not a reckless rage. It was the cold, clear-headed anger of a father, a man who had spent half his life defending the law. Daniel Voss, the name of my glamorous son-in-law, the wealthy CEO who never stopped preaching about morality. He was the one who did this. He had mercilessly pushed his wife down the stairs. He had killed his own flesh and blood. His cruelty went beyond every limit of human decency. I rushed to my car in a state of intense focus. My mind worked like a machine. During my years in the judiciary, I had faced thousands of criminals. I knew how to deal with people who believed they were above the law. The Voss family had money and power. They thought they could hide any crime. They thought they could use money to silence everyone. They were wrong. They forgot one important thing. They had just harmed the daughter of a federal judge. I would not allow my daughter to endure this injustice alone. A battle for justice and accountability officially began at that very moment. I would tear away Daniel Voss's mask before the entire world. He would pay for what he had done. As my car sped through the fog, the face of Daniel Voss filled my mind. A man so perfect it was unsettling. Handsome, successful, and born into a notorious billionaire dynasty. He was the CEO of a major financial corporation. My daughter Claire, an intelligent woman with a successful career of her own, had been blinded by that aura. She truly believed she had found the man of her dreams. I, however, felt differently. After 31 years on the federal bench, I had learned how to see beneath the surface. I never trusted that son-in-law of mine. From the very first family gathering where I met him, I sensed something was wrong. When Daniel looked at Claire, I did not see the eyes of a man in love. I saw the eyes of a predator. A sickening sense of possession was evident in every gesture. He wanted to control Claire. He viewed my daughter as nothing more than an expensive ornament to enhance his image of perfection. The arrogance of the Voss family ran in their blood. They looked at the world through the eyes of those who believed they were entitled to decide everyone else's fate. To them, money could buy anything. The law was merely a toy for the poor. Jeffrey Voss, Daniel's father, was a seasoned fox in the business world. He had taught his son that nothing mattered more than the interests of the family. No one, not even a wife or child, was allowed to stand in their way. When Claire became pregnant, I thought the arrival of a child might soften that cold-hearted man. My daughter was so happy. She counted the days until she could welcome her first child into the world. The baby, 7 months along, was growing strong and healthy. That child was the hope of our entire family. But to the Voss family, the baby seemed to be a threat to the enormous fortune they controlled. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. A cold fury surged through my chest. My poor Claire had been living with a devil wearing the mask of an angel. She had been far too innocent to see through the promises and declarations of love. She had no idea that behind the grand doors of the Vale Mansion a dark conspiracy was taking shape. A conspiracy so sinister that even in her worst nightmares she could never have imagined it. My car was approaching the hospital. The constant wail of ambulance sirens made the atmosphere even more suffocating. I knew I had to remain strong for my daughter. But one question kept drilling deeper into my mind. Why would a husband be so cruel to his pregnant wife? What had happened behind the veil of secrecy at the Vale Mansion that night? What earth-shattering secret had my daughter accidentally overheard from Daniel and his father that made them determined to eliminate that innocent child at any cost? I walked into the hospital room with a heavy heart. Claire lay there, her face pale and drained of all color. Her swollen, lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. When she saw me, tears began streaming down her cheeks again. I wrapped my arms around her trembling, fragile shoulders. I listened in silence. I let her tell me the entire dark truth hidden behind the walls of the Vale mansion. It had all begun the night before. Claire had gone downstairs to get a glass of warm water. As she passed the study, she noticed the light was still on. Heated voices were coming from inside. It was Daniel and his father, Jeffrey Voss. She was about to walk in when she froze after hearing the words trust fund. Something in her instincts told her that something was wrong. She quietly stood behind the thick wooden door and began listening. The words spoken by those two men sent a chill down Claire's spine. Jeffrey Voss was furious. He slammed his hand on the desk and began talking about an inheritance clause in the family trust. It turned out that if the child in Claire's womb was born, 1/3 of the family fortune and corporate control would automatically be transferred into the child's name. That would mean Jeffrey's absolute authority would be weakened. He could not accept that. He viewed his unborn grandchild as a threat. Daniel did not object. He agreed with his father. The words Claire repeated to me filled me with overwhelming rage. He said the child had come at the wrong time. He viewed his own flesh and blood as a problem that needed to be solved in order to maintain control of the money. The two of them calmly discussed ways to delay the birth or find legal grounds to strip the child of inheritance rights. Their lack of humanity was horrifying. They possessed not a shred of compassion. All they saw were numbers and checks. Claire stood frozen in place. Her entire body felt weak. The 7-month-old baby gently moved inside her womb, as though seeking protection from its mother. Yet its father and grandfather were treating it like an obstacle that needed to be removed. The betrayal was too great. It was more than any woman could bear. I could feel my blood boiling as I listened. The moral decay of the wealthy Voss family was fully exposed. They were willing to sacrifice anything to protect their throne of wealth and power. Claire's voice broke into silent sobs as she reached this part of the story. She decided she could not remain silent. She pushed open the door and stepped inside to confront her husband. But she had no idea that this courageous act would place her directly in danger. How did Daniel Voss's perfect mask finally shatter when his wife exposed him? When the study door burst open, Daniel turned around. Claire stood there, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes burned with fury. Through her pain, she screamed, demanding to know how he could be so cruel to his own child. Jeffrey Voss remained silent. He stepped back and watched coldly. As for Daniel, the perfect husband, everyone knew he suddenly transformed completely. Claire's description of that moment sent chills down my spine. There was not a trace of emotion left on his face. The warm eyes she saw every day had become two hollow, lifeless pits. The perfect mask fell away, revealing a cold-blooded monster underneath. He took slow steps toward Claire. No explanation. No remorse. He looked at her only as an enemy who possessed a secret that could destroy him. In a low, threatening voice, he growled, "You were never supposed to hear any of this." Terrified, Claire backed away. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, protecting her 7-month-old baby. He forced her all the way into the hallway, right to the edge of the steep staircase. His greed had driven him beyond reason. Daniel struck. He shoved Claire hard in the shoulder. A brutal, deliberate push. She tumbled down the unforgiving stone steps. Claire's desperate screams echoed throughout the grand yet cold Vale mansion. He stood at the top of the staircase and watched his wife fall without making the slightest attempt to help her. By that point, I could no longer contain myself. I gripped my daughter's ice-cold hand. The cold fury inside me reached its peak. I looked directly into Claire's eyes. I did not tell her that everything would be all right the way weaker fathers often do. I was a judge. I knew nothing would ever be all right as long as the criminal remained free. I leaned close to her ear and made a solemn vow. "I promise you this Daniel Voss will pay with both his reputation and his life as he knows it. I will bring justice back for my grandchild." I stood up and walked out of the hospital room. Grief had now given way to a flawless battle plan. My opponent was a massive financial empire. They had money connections and the finest lawyers available to twist the truth. But they had underestimated a father driven by vengeance. I knew exactly what I had to do. I picked up my phone and began activating my network. What secret cards was federal judge Richard Harmon about to reveal in his battle against the Voss family? I walked down the hospital corridor. The sound of my solitary footsteps echoed steadily. My anger transformed into something cold and razor-sharp. My opponents were powerful. The Voss family controlled enormous resources. They could bribe witnesses. They could destroy evidence. But they had made one fatal mistake. They believed I was nothing more than a retired old man. I stopped at the far end of the hallway and dialed the first number. Sandra Chen, the finest attorney in the region. She had once been my student. I briefly explained Claire's situation. No lengthy explanation was necessary. Sandra immediately understood her assignment. She would send an emergency preservation notice to the Vale mansion at once. A strict legal hold would prevent the Voss family from tampering with the scene. Every security camera, every phone record, and every piece of evidence had to be preserved. But the legal battle was only half the war. To bring down an empire, I needed the truths they had buried. I dialed the second number. This call was for my brother Thomas Harmon. Thomas was a veteran and a former FBI investigator specializing in financial crimes. He was a ghost in every sense of the word. A man who operated in the shadows and always uncovered what others desperately tried to hide. The Voss family had absolutely no idea Thomas even existed within my circle. I spoke into the phone. Daniel killed our grandchild. I need you to uncover every stain on his name. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. I could hear my brother drawing a deep breath filled with fury. Thomas replied with only a single sentence. Give me 72 hours. The hidden battlefield had been established. Some of the sharpest minds in law and investigation were now in position. We would not confront the Voss family with brute force. We would tighten the noose around their necks with evidence they could never deny. That night, the hunt began. Thomas traveled all the way to Chicago, where Daniel had built his career before marrying Claire. What horrifying secrets would the former FBI investigator uncover in the past of this seemingly perfect CEO? The next 72 hours felt like an eternity. I remained by Claire's hospital bed the entire time. Watching my daughter suffer both physically and emotionally tore at my heart, but I knew I could not afford to break. With each passing hour, Thomas sent me updates. His relentless investigation in Chicago had begun peeling away Daniel Voss's carefully crafted facade. It turned out that pushing Claire down the stairs was not the first time this man had used violence to solve his problems. Thomas uncovered a sealed file dating back 5 years. In Chicago, a female employee had once accused Daniel of assault. She had been forced into silence with a settlement worth millions of dollars. The Voss family had used its influence to erase every trace of the incident from the media. They had turned the victim into a liar. Daniel Voss was a systematic predator. He always used money to silence anyone who stood in his way. But this time, his target was my daughter. The Voss family's protection had created a monster that feared nothing. Yet the biggest breakthrough was not in Chicago. It was inside the Vale mansion itself, where Claire had been attacked. Under the cover of a maintenance technician, Thomas gained access to the building's network. There he discovered a secret that even the Voss father and son had forgotten. Jeffrey Voss, a man who trusted no one, had installed a hidden audio recording system in every executive office 15 years earlier. He had originally done it to monitor business partners, and even his own son. But as the years passed and his confidence in his power grew, Jeffrey had completely forgotten the system existed. The aging equipment had continued operating silently in the shadows. It recorded every sound and every conversation that took place inside that fateful room. Thomas successfully extracted all the data from the night of the incident. The original audio file was protected by an outdated encryption algorithm. For a former FBI specialist like Thomas, breaking it was only a matter of time. I received his message when the clock struck 3 in the morning. It contained only 4 words. I got the evidence. I stared out the hospital window. Dawn was approaching. The silence I had maintained for days was about to end. The legal noose was ready. How horrifying were the cold, unfiltered words spoken by Jeffrey and Daniel Voss on that hidden recording. Would the Voss empire realize before it was too late that they had personally tied the very noose that was now tightening around their own necks? The arrest warrant for Daniel Voss was issued late one afternoon. Police stormed the Vale mansion while the Voss father and son were having dinner. Jeffrey Voss showed no sign of panic. He calmly rose from his chair. The arrogance of a man who ruled an empire was written across his face. He looked at the officers and scoffed. He called the entire situation a ridiculous misunderstanding. Jeffrey believed that power and his team of multi-million-dollar attorneys would easily save his son. They thought they could twist the truth the way they always had. If you've followed the story this far, then you're probably finding it interesting. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a number 5 in the comments so I know you've made it this far, and share your prediction for how the story will end to see whether you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. The Voss family's confidence rested on one assumption: the staircase scene had been thoroughly cleaned. There were no witnesses. There were no direct security cameras. Daniel Voss stood behind his father with a smug smile. He believed Claire's testimony alone would be crushed in court. He thought I was nothing more than a helpless father making a desperate attempt to fight back. But my satisfaction began the moment Thomas walked into the interrogation room. In his hand was a black hard drive. Thomas looked directly into Jeffrey Voss's eyes and pressed play. The recording lasted exactly 43 minutes. An original digital audio file that could not be forged. Thomas had uncovered 43 minutes of recorded evidence detailing the conspiracy to eliminate the unborn child. Jeffrey's voice came through clearly. We need to deal with the baby before it affects the trust. Then Daniel's voice followed. I'll take care of it. An accident will be the cleanest solution. The color immediately drained from Jeffrey Voss's face before turning a sickly gray. Daniel's triumphant smile froze on his polished face. The noose had tightened. At that moment, all the money and influence in the world became worthless in the face of such overwhelming evidence. For the first time, both father and son realized they had walked straight into a trap from which there was no escape. The federal courtroom was packed that day. The atmosphere was so solemn and suffocating that every anxious breath seemed audible. Reporters crowded the hallways outside. Everyone wanted to witness the downfall of one of the most powerful families in the country. Daniel Voss sat at the defense table. His expensive suit could no longer conceal his unease. The confidence he carried every day had completely vanished. In its place was overwhelming fear. Claire stood before the court as both a witness and a victim. She had lost weight, but the strength had returned to her eyes. I was not seated on the judge's bench that day. Instead, I sat in the gallery right beside my daughter. I was there not as a powerful federal judge. I was there as a father protecting his child. I wanted Daniel Voss to see that I would be the strongest wall standing behind Claire. Attorney Sandra Chen rose to her feet. She began presenting the facts of the case with her usual precision and sharpness. When Daniel attempted to deny every accusation, Sandra calmly requested permission to introduce the classified evidence. The judge nodded in approval. The courtroom audio system came to life. A suffocating silence fell across the entire courtroom as the recording began to play. Jeffrey Voss's cold, ruthless voice echoed through the chamber. Then came Daniel's chilling response about arranging a clean accident. The naked truth spoken by the Voss father and son cut through the silence like blades. Murmurs spread throughout the courtroom. People shook their heads in disbelief. Furious eyes turned toward the two men responsible for the crime. Daniel Voss lowered his head onto the table. He could not bring himself to look at anyone. The 43-minute recording completely stripped away the mask of the polished CEO. It exposed the monster underneath for everyone to see. The truth had been revealed beyond any possibility of denial. No amount of money, and not even the most expensive lawyers in the world, could save them now. The presiding judge's gavel struck with a sharp crack. The sound was like thunder ending a long season of darkness. The entire courtroom held its breath. Daniel Voss rose to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The arrogance he once carried had completely vanished. In its place stood a condemned man awaiting the final judgment of justice. The judge began reading the sentence. Each word rang through the courtroom with unmistakable force. Daniel Voss was sentenced to 18 years in prison for aggravated assault and conspiracy to harm an unborn child. Jeffrey Voss, the architect behind the scheme, received a 6-year federal sentence for aiding the crime and concealing criminal conduct. 18 years and 6 years. That was the price they would pay with their freedom for valuing wealth above human life. A deep sense of satisfaction filled my chest as I watched the handcuffs snap around Daniel's wrists. He looked toward Claire and me with pleading eyes. But it was far too late. Justice had been carried out completely. This victory required no violence. It was built through perseverance, truth, and respect for the law. Yet the downfall of the Voss family did not end behind prison walls. The verdict triggered a chain reaction that destroyed the entire family legacy. Shares of Voss Financial collapsed immediately after the trial. Business partners rushed to distance themselves from the company. The most symbolic moment came a week later. The Voss family name was officially removed from the City Art Museum's Wall of Honor. It was the complete collapse of people who once believed they were untouchable. Money could not purchase honor once that honor had been stained by the blood of the innocent. I held Claire tightly as the courtroom slowly emptied. She cried, but this time they were tears of relief. The battle that had lasted 14 long months was finally over. The Voss Empire had become nothing more than a dark chapter of the past. Yet when the fire of vengeance finally faded, I discovered an unexpected emptiness within myself. The tragedy had left deep emotional scars on both of us. After exposing the crimes of others, I realized that healing would be our next challenge. Several weeks later, Claire and I sat together on the porch of my home in Asheville. The same pine trees swayed gently in the breeze. The evening sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "Dad, do you think they were always evil?" I looked out toward the horizon before answering. "No. I think they spent so much time chasing power that they forgot what power was supposed to be for." Claire lowered her eyes. "They had everything." "Yes," I replied softly. "And that was the problem. They believed having everything entitled them to do anything." The wind rustled through the trees. I placed my hand over hers. "Power is a tool, Claire. It can build a family, protect people, and create opportunities. But when power becomes more important than people, it turns into a weapon. That's what destroyed them." She nodded slowly. "And what about us?" I smiled for the first time in many months. "We keep living. We honor those we lost by refusing to become like the people who hurt us." Tears formed in her eyes once more, but this time there was peace in them. That evening, neither of us spoke much after that. We simply sat together and watched the sun disappear beyond the mountains. For 31 years, I had believed that justice was about verdicts, sentences, and courtrooms. I was wrong. Justice is only the beginning. The harder task is learning how to heal after the truth has finally been revealed. And sometimes the greatest victory is not bringing down an empire. Sometimes it is helping the people you love find the strength to smile again. The presiding judge's gavel struck with a sharp crack. The sound was like thunder bringing an end to a long season of darkness. The entire courtroom held its breath. Daniel Voss rose to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The arrogance he once carried had completely disappeared. In its place was the face of a condemned man awaiting judgment from justice itself. The judge began reading the sentence. Each word echoed through the courtroom with unmistakable force. Daniel Voss was sentenced to 18 years in prison for aggravated assault and conspiracy to kill an unborn child. Jeffrey Voss, the mastermind behind the scheme, received a 6-year federal prison sentence for aiding the crime and concealing criminal conduct. 18 years and 6 years, that was the price they would pay with their freedom for valuing wealth above human life. A deep sense of satisfaction surged through me as I watched the handcuffs snap around Daniel's wrists. He looked toward Claire and me with pleading eyes. But it was far too late. Justice had been carried out completely. This sweet revenge required no violence. It was built through perseverance and respect for the rule of law. Yet the downfall of the Voss family did not end behind prison walls. The ripple effects of the verdict destroyed the entire family legacy. Shares of Voss Financial plummeted immediately after the trial. Business partners rushed to distance themselves from the company. The most symbolic moment came a week later. The Voss family name was officially chiseled away and removed from the City Art Museum's Wall of Honor. It was the complete collapse of people who once believed they were untouchable. Money could not buy honor once it had been stained by the blood of the innocent. I held Claire tightly as people gradually left the courtroom. She cried, but this time they were tears of relief. The battle that had lasted 14 long months was finally over. The Voss Empire had faded into a dark chapter of the past. Yet when the fire of vengeance finally cooled, I discovered a great silence within my soul. The tragedy had left deep emotional scars on both of us. After exposing the crimes of others, how would an old judge like me help my daughter continue the journey toward healing? What lesson about power would emerge from our final conversation together? Claire and I returned to our small home in Asheville. The fog had lifted. Warm sunlight filtered through the old pine trees. We sat together on the porch, 2 cups of hot tea released gentle streams of steam into the morning air. After 14 long months, I finally saw my daughter smile again. It was a smile of relief and peace. I looked at Claire and reflected on everything that had happened. This legal system can sometimes be unfair to those without money. People like the Voss family always believe they can build walls of protection out of wealth and influence. But they were wrong. Never underestimate the silence of people who understand the truth. Power and money may hide wrongdoing for a time, but the kindness, wisdom, and persistence of someone who genuinely cares will always find a crack through which the truth can emerge. Justice may arrive late, but it is unavoidable. Blind arrogance will always lead to ruin. Claire's emotional wounds would take time to heal, but she was ready to move forward. The ordeal had made her far stronger than before. Thank you for staying with Dad's Real Life Revenge until the end of this story. Join our community by hitting the like button and subscribing to enjoy more gripping and realistic family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. I hosted a party to celebrate my 60th birthday. My wife and my son handed me a gift. Inside it was a piece of paper that turned out to be an eviction notice and divorce papers. The business, the house, everything was gone. My son mocked me, saying I was a pathetic old failure. They burst out laughing. I signed the papers and walked out. But 1 week later there were 32 desperate phone calls. The night breeze brushed softly across my face. The smell of honey-glazed ribs drifted through the air. Lanterns hanging from the old oak tree cast a warm golden glow. I stood in front of the grill holding the same pair of meat tongs I had used for years. Around me were the voices and laughter of neighbors and longtime business partners. Today I turned 60 years old. 60 years of life filled with struggle and hard-earned victories. I had built Hendricks Construction from absolutely nothing. I once carried heavy bags of cement under the burning sun just to create the foundation for everything I now owned. I looked toward the main table. Chloe, my wife, was smiling gracefully while talking with her friends. She was wearing the emerald silk dress I bought for her last year. Paul, my son, stood beside her. He held a glass of wine and carried himself like the successful businessman I had always been proud of. A deep sense of satisfaction filled my chest. I told myself that all the hardship I endured had finally been rewarded with a peaceful and happy family. Suddenly Paul cleared his throat and lightly tapped his glass. The crowd fell silent and turned toward my son. "Dad, we have a special gift for you," Paul announced loudly. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket. Chloe stepped closer and placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Open it, Robert," she whispered. I set the meat tongs down and wiped my hands on my apron. My heart began beating faster, a mixture of curiosity and emotion. I thought it might be tickets for a trip around the world, or maybe a family photograph framed in silver. Slowly I opened the envelope and pulled out the papers inside. The very first line I saw made my breath catch in my throat. "Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. I am truly glad you are here. Make sure you subscribe to follow my story all the way to the end, and leave a comment with the city you are watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Notice of termination of residency and eviction." I blinked, thinking I must have read it wrong. I turned to the next page. A unilateral divorce filing with terms that stripped me of every piece of our shared property. Everything inside my head started spinning. This house, this company, the bank accounts. None of it belonged to me anymore. I looked up at Chloe, hoping this was nothing more than a cruel joke. But her face had turned cold as ice. Her eyes were filled with a level of contempt I had never seen in 25 years of marriage. Paul stepped forward, tilting his chin at me with open arrogance. He leaned close to my ear, making sure I heard every poisonous word. "You are a pathetic old failure," Paul sneered. "Your time is over. Now it is time for you to disappear so I can run everything." Their laughter exploded right after that, loud and merciless. The guests around us began whispering, but not one person stepped forward to help me. I felt like a wounded animal being exposed in the middle of a crowd. The blood in my veins burned, then suddenly turned ice cold. I looked down at the papers, then at the fountain pen in Paul's pocket. "Give me the pen," I said, my voice dropping into something dangerously calm. Paul handed it to me with a victorious smile. I signed my name on those documents with firm, deliberate strokes. The scratching sound of the pen cutting across the paper felt like the sound of my own heart breaking. I removed the apron that said World's #1 Dad. I placed it on the table right beside the plate of ribs, still steaming with heat. I did not say another word. I turned around and walked away, leaving behind the bright lights and the people who had betrayed me. I stepped out through the gate with less than $400 in my pocket. But in the middle of that collapse, a single thought flashed through my mind. They had forgotten who laid the foundation of this kingdom. I walked along the sidewalk of the wealthy neighborhood. Most of the mansions here had been built by my company. Every brick, every fence carried the mark of my sweat. I remembered 3 years ago when I became seriously ill. Chloe cried beside my hospital bed and said she needed power of attorney to protect the family. Because I loved her, because I trusted her, I signed without a single doubt. It turned out she had been preparing for this day from that very moment. She and my son had been quietly moving assets for a long time. They isolated me from major projects. They convinced me I was getting old and needed to step back. This betrayal hurt far more than any physical wound I had ever suffered. I stopped at an old gas station at the end of the street. I pulled out my worn wallet and checked inside. $327. That was all I had left after 30 years of devotion. Enough for one night at a cheap motel and a few simple meals. But when I looked at my reflection in the gas station window, I saw a man who had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. Paul thought he had won because he had the money. Chloe thought she had won because she had the house. But they were wrong. They had awakened an old lion that they should have left sleeping. I would not use a gun. I would not use a knife. I would take my revenge, using the same things that built my entire career: patience, strategy, and the cold precision of a master builder. This game had only just begun, and the ending would make them regret it for the rest of their lives. I staggered along the dark road. Paul's laughter still echoed faintly behind the iron gate. My mind drifted back to the winter of 2023. That was when the severe pneumonia made my lungs feel like they had frozen solid. I was lying in a hospital bed at the Central Medical Center. Around me was the lifeless beeping of heart monitors. Chloe sat beside me, her eyes red from crying. She held my hand, those warm hands I had trusted for so many years. "Robert, the company is in trouble without your signature," she sobbed. "The suppliers are threatening to stop deliveries. The workers are worried because they have not been paid." She placed a thick stack of documents in front of me. She said it was only a limited power of attorney to handle temporary matters, so that I could focus on recovering without worrying about the business. At that time, my mind was clouded by antibiotics and a fever that refused to break. I looked into my wife's eyes and saw nothing but sincere concern. I picked up the pen and signed exactly where she pointed. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I had signed a full power of attorney that could not easily be reversed. I had handed them the key to the treasure I spent 30 years building. The moment I was discharged from the hospital, the changes began quietly. Paul started changing the passwords to the internal management systems. He said it was to protect company information from competitors. Chloe began taking over every email account and every phone call from the banks. Whenever I wanted to review the books, they used my health as a shield. "Dad needs to rest. The doctor said you must not deal with stress," Paul would say. They arranged long vacations for me in distant places. It turned out that was their way of isolating me from my most loyal partners. They fired the master craftsmen who had fought beside me for decades. They replaced them with people who only knew how to obey Paul. Tonight, standing under the dim streetlight, I finally understood the entire truth. This birthday party had never been meant to celebrate my life. It was a victory celebration for two traitors. They waited until every legal procedure was completely finished. They waited until I no longer had any value left for them. Paul stepped out onto the balcony of the house and looked down at me standing outside the fence. He held a stack of documents and threw them into the air. Sheets of paper fluttered down like pale moths in the night. "Those are copies of the tax reports you signed," Paul shouted. "Everything is completely legal, dear father. You cannot sue. You cannot take anything back, because you were the one who handed it all to us with your own signature." I watched the papers fall into a dirty puddle beside the road. The anger inside me ignited, burning away the shock that had frozen me moments earlier. I had not only lost my home, I had lost my faith in people. I looked back at the mansion one last time. Those dazzling lights now looked more like a glittering tomb, a tomb that had buried my kindness and my trust. I turned away and walked toward the town center. I needed somewhere to rest and think. I needed to find the weakness in the perfect trap they had built around me. They believed I had been disarmed. They believed I was just an old man waiting to die in poverty. But they forgot something important. The blueprint of that entire house still existed inside my head, and I knew exactly which wall to strike to bring their whole structure crashing down. I would make them regret letting me walk out of that gate alive. I stopped in front of the flickering neon sign of the Sunset Motel. The letters S and T were broken, leaving only the word UNS glowing dimly through the light drizzle. It was the cheapest place I could find on the edge of town. I pushed open the stained glass door and stepped into the reception area. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard looked at me with open suspicion. "One single room," I said, my voice rough from the cold. $50 a night. "Pay in advance," he replied shortly. I pulled a $50 bill from the small stack of cash in my wallet. My hand trembled slightly as I placed it on the scratched wooden counter. He handed me a metal key attached to a red plastic tag. "Room 12. End of the hallway on the left," he muttered, already turning back to the television. I walked down the hallway on a carpet that smelled of dampness and years of cigarette smoke. The door to room 12 opened with a dry squeal from hinges that had not seen oil in a long time. The space inside was cramped and suffocating. A single bed with a thin, worn blanket, an old television sitting on a crooked wooden shelf, and a small window overlooking a trash-scattered parking lot. I closed the door, locked it, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The weight of reality began pressing down on my chest. Just a few hours earlier, I had been the owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. Now I was sitting in a cheap room that even my workers would have complained about. I took out my wallet and emptied everything onto the mattress. A few wrinkled bills, my identification card, and the final balance on my phone's banking app, $327. I stared at my hands under the flickering fluorescent light on the ceiling. These calluses were proof of 30 years of labor. They had built dream homes for thousands of people, yet now they could not even hold onto a roof for the man who built them. I collapsed onto the bed, staring blankly at the stained ceiling. The loneliness of 60 years old crashed over me like a violent wave. I remembered the warm dinners I once shared with Chloe. I remembered teaching Paul how to read his very first construction blueprint. All of it had been a carefully staged performance. They had patiently waited for me to grow old. They had patiently waited for the moment I became vulnerable enough to take everything from me. The roar of a truck engine outside the motel startled me back to reality. I realized I could not lie here feeling sorry for myself. Their betrayal might have been a sentence, but I would turn it into a declaration of war. I sat up and opened the only bag I had managed to take with me. Inside there were no expensive clothes, only my identification papers and a small iron box. That box carried memories from the days when my parents were still alive. I placed my hand on the cold metal surface. In the darkness of the Sunset Motel, I made a silent promise to myself. Paul and Chloe might have taken my money, but they could never take my mind or my will. Tomorrow I would begin finding my way back, step by step, even if I had to start from the ashes. This rock bottom was not where my story ended. It was where I would begin, laying a new foundation stronger than any structure I had ever built before. I reached over and switched on the old desk lamp. The weak yellow light trembled across the surface of the small iron box. It was the only thing I managed to grab when they forced me out of the house. Paul used to call it my pile of nostalgic junk. But to me, it was the last thread connecting me to the people who had truly loved me. I opened the lid. The dry scrape of metal echoed softly in the quiet room. Inside were a few medals from my college years, several black and white photographs of my parents, and a thick, light brown envelope resting at the bottom. Across the front, written in my mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Bobby." My throat tightened the moment my fingers touched her handwriting. My mother had been a frugal woman. She worked as a seamstress for years before opening a small bakery. She always told me, "A man needs an escape route when the storm comes, Bobby." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were not old letters. It was a savings book and a stack of deposit certificates. I opened the book and the numbers seemed to dance under the dim light. The final deposit had been made 2 months before she passed away. With decades of accumulated interest, the balance had reached $91,000. I froze. $91,000. To a millionaire, it would be pocket change for a minor project. But to a man sitting at rock bottom with only $327 left, it was a fortune. It was my mother's blood, sweat, and silent sacrifice over an entire lifetime. She had hidden it away. She never told my father. She never even told me. As if she had somehow foreseen the day her son would lose everything. I shuffled through the remaining papers. A short letter slipped out, the ink slightly faded. Bobby, if you are reading this, it means life has become difficult for you. Do not feel ashamed to accept help from your old mother. Use this to start again because you are the finest builder I have ever known. Tears fell onto the page, blurring the word builder. While I had been busy building castles for people who would betray me, my mother had quietly built a lifeboat for me. I gripped the savings book tightly in my hand. Chloe and Paul believed they had drained the last drop of blood from me. They had no idea that a mother's love could reach beyond death to protect her child. This money was not just capital. It was salvation. It was proof that I was not alone in this fight. I looked out the small window. In the distance, the city lights still burned brightly. The plan for my revenge began to take shape more clearly in my mind. I would not waste a single dollar. That $91,000 would be the first brick, the brick that would shatter Paul's arrogance, the brick that would throw Chloe out of the house she had stolen. I placed the savings book back into the iron box and locked it carefully. Tonight, for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of calm. Their betrayal had been a death sentence for family bonds, but it had also been the rebirth of my strength. Sleep, Robert, I told myself. Tomorrow, the hunt begins. I was about to close the iron box when my fingers brushed against another rough layer of paper. It was wedged beneath the lining at the bottom of the box. I pulled it out carefully. It was an old land ownership certificate, yellowed with age, stamped sometime in the 1970s. The document listed the owner as my Uncle Thomas, my late bachelor uncle, who had passed away many years ago. A faint memory returned to me. He had left me a piece of land on the northern edge of the city. At the time, I had been at the peak of my career, managing dozens of multi-million-dollar construction projects. That 12-acre patch of weeds and gravel had felt more like a tax burden than an asset, so I forgot about it completely. Paul and Chloe certainly had no idea it even existed, because it had been inherited directly from the Hendricks family long before I married Chloe. I opened my phone, dust still clinging to my fingers, and started searching through the city planning maps. My heart began pounding when I saw the location on the newest satellite map. The land sat right along the border of the North Technology Development District. The city had recently announced plans to expand the roadway and build a new belt route cutting directly through that area. Property values there had skyrocketed over the past 2 years. What had once been worthless wilderness was now a potential gold mine. I checked several recent land transactions nearby. $137,000 per acre. 12 acres. The number forming in my mind forced me to hold my breath to stay calm. This was the leverage I needed. They believed they had taken everything by freezing the company accounts. But they could not touch what they did not know existed. The legacy of the Hendricks family was rising to protect the last heir who still carried its integrity. I looked out the window of the Sunset Motel as darkness slowly retreated before the first light of dawn. A detailed plan began forming in my mind like a 3-dimensional architectural blueprint. I would not sell the land immediately for quick cash. I would use it as collateral to rebuild my legal credibility. I would construct a new fortress on the very foundation they had overlooked. Chloe wanted money. She would watch money turn to dust. Paul wanted power. He would watch power collapse beneath the feet of the father he had mocked. I carefully placed the land certificate back into the box beside my mother's savings book. Tomorrow morning, my first destination would not be my old company. It would be the office of an old friend, the only man honest enough to stand against Chloe's army of lawyers. I lay down, but my eyes refused to close. I could still see Paul laughing at me during the party. Laugh while you can, my son. You took away what I built over 30 years. But I will take back everything, and the souls of the traitors along with it, and I will do it within a few short months. This battle is no longer about money. It is about proving that a true builder can never be defeated by those who only know how to steal the work of others. The sun had risen, and with it came the beginning of their end. 8 in the morning. I stood in front of the office building of Tom Bradley. Tom was an old lawyer known throughout the city for his integrity and for legal counterattacks that showed absolutely no mercy. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and a brass bell rang sharply. Tom looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. His thick eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Robert, I heard about the party last night," he said quietly. "The whole city is talking about how your wife and son threw you out of your own house." I placed my bag on his desk and pulled out my mother's savings book and the yellowed land certificate. "I did not come here for sympathy, Tom," I replied coldly. "I came for justice." We spent the next 6 hours dissecting every detail of the documents. Tom studied each page of the power of attorney I had signed in the hospital. His eyes stopped at a small clause near the bottom of the final page. "They were clever," Robert, Tom said, tapping the paper lightly. "They inserted a clause allowing the appointed party to transfer shared marital assets. But in their greed, they made a fatal mistake." I held my breath. Tom slid my Uncle Thomas's land certificate back across the desk. "This property is separate inherited land from before your marriage. Under the law, even with a full power of attorney, they cannot legally transfer or control separate inherited property without explicit written consent from you for that specific purpose. And that is not all." Tom gave a faint knowing smile. "Your mother's savings account is also a direct personal inheritance. Any attempt by Chloe to merge it into marital assets or freeze it would be illegal." A surge of electricity ran through my spine. The wall they built was beginning to crack. Tom continued flipping through company documents related to Paul's management. He fired the old accountants and replaced them with his own people. "That is a classic sign of someone trying to hide questionable financial flows," Tom said calmly. I looked him in the eyes, feeling the fire of revenge growing stronger. "I want the power of attorney revoked immediately," I said firmly. "And I want you to draft a notice to the banks establishing my exclusive ownership of the northern land." Tom nodded, his fingers already moving quickly across the keyboard. "We are not just going to defend ourselves, Robert. We are going to strike their weakest point, their arrogance. I will submit the revocation of the power of attorney at the exact moment they are executing a major financial transaction. Their accounts will freeze at the very moment they believe they have already secured victory." I left Tom's office late in the afternoon. In my pocket was now a perfectly structured legal strategy. I walked down the street watching the crowds moving quickly through the city. Chloe and Paul were probably enjoying their luxurious life inside my house. They had no idea that the sword of justice had already begun to slide out of its sheath. My silence today was not surrender. It was preparation for a storm they could never imagine. Everything they built on deception was about to collapse like a sandcastle before the tide. I did not stop with the lawyer's office. Real revenge requires more than legal paperwork. It requires the naked truth about your enemy. I used a small portion of my mother's money to hire an independent financial investigator. He was an old bloodhound of a man I had once helped when he was just starting out. 2 days later, we met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. He slid a thin folder across the table, but its contents carried enormous weight. "Your son is not the business genius he thinks he is, Robert," he said. "Paul is a professional debtor in the online gambling world." I opened the folder and felt my chest tighten. Paul had lost more than $200,000 on illegal offshore betting platforms. To cover those losses, he had done something unforgivable. He had secretly mortgaged the family home for $185,000. The house where I personally laid every single brick of the foundation. The house Chloe once swore she loved more than her own life. But that was not the end of it. Hendrik's construction had become nothing more than an empty shell. Paul had been using deposits from new construction projects to pay off his personal gambling debts. He now owed wages to workers and payments to dozens of subcontractors and material suppliers. A rot deep to the bone was spreading through the heart of the empire I built. He had not only betrayed me, he was destroying the Hendricks legacy itself. I scanned the list of stalled projects. One name stood out immediately: the Morrison Estate Project. Margaret Morrison was one of my most respected and demanding clients. She was known for having zero tolerance for delays or compromised quality. At that moment, I realized I had found their Achilles heel. Paul was desperately trying to keep everything hidden by using the power of attorney to drain the company's remaining reserve funds. If I cut off that financial lifeline now, the entire structure he built would explode. Creditors would descend like vultures smelling blood, and Chloe would finally realize that the son she protected was nothing more than a reckless destroyer. The truth was more bitter than I expected, but it gave me an absolute advantage. I did not need to destroy them myself. All I had to do was allow their greed and stupidity to destroy them. I paid the bill, gathered the folder, and stepped outside into the harsh sunlight. Inside my mind, a new move had already been placed on the board. I would contact Margaret Morrison. I would show her the truth about the man currently managing her project, and I would offer her a solution she could not refuse. Paul believed he had already won by taking control of the Hendricks name, but he forgot something important. Clients trusted that name because of me. Without credibility, a name is nothing more than a piece of paper. I tightened my grip on the folder, feeling strength returning to my bones. My enemies were digging their own grave. My only job now was to make sure there was no escape when the ground finally collapsed beneath them. I sat in my temporary office, a narrow room that still smelled of fresh paint. On the glass door, the words Hendricks Renovations were still drying. This was the new company I had just established using the money my mother saved for me. I picked up my phone. My finger hovered over one name: Margaret Morrison. She was a steel-willed woman who never tolerated delays. I pressed the call button. "Robert, I thought you retired to some island somewhere." Her sharp voice came through the phone. "I did not retire, Margaret. I am just cleaning up the ruins," I replied. I told her the truth about Paul's financial situation and the reality behind the construction of her mansion. Her face must have turned pale when she heard the number tied to my son's gambling debts. 1 hour later, we met at the stalled construction site. Machines stood silent. Workers sat around talking, unpaid and restless. Mrs. Morrison watched as Paul tried desperately to explain something to a material supplier who was demanding payment. My son looked pathetic in his expensive suit, his eyes darting around in fear. I stepped out from the shadow of the corridor. Paul froze. The coffee cup in his hand trembled. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he stammered. I did not answer him. I looked straight at Margaret Morrison. "I will take over this project with my new company," I said calmly. "I do not need a deposit. All I need is for you to sign a direct contract with me. I will personally cover the material costs using my land as collateral." Mrs. Morrison nodded without hesitation. "Paul, you are fired," she said coldly. I watched my son's face change from red to ghost white. "You cannot do this. You signed power of attorney to Mom," he shouted. That was when I pulled the notice from Tom Bradley out of my folder. "That power of attorney was revoked at 8 this morning, Paul," I said slowly. "Every account you plan to use to cover your gambling debts has been frozen for investigation. You do not have a single dollar left to move around anymore." He collapsed onto the ground among the scattered bricks and concrete. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was a defeated man staring into the abyss. If you have stayed with this story until this moment, please take a quick second to subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing, and it helps us more than you know. I turned and walked away, ignoring the angry shouting of creditors who were now surrounding Paul. If this story meant something to you, press like and help share the message about resilience. My journey to reclaim justice was now 3/4 complete. Every step I took now was calculated like an architectural blueprint. I knew Chloe was probably at home at that very moment, trying to use her credit cards, only to have them rejected. Soon she would realize that the luxurious house she stole had become nothing more than a cage without food. I returned to my small office and opened the project blueprints for the Morrison estate. I would work through the night. I would rebuild the reputation of the Hendricks name with these very hands. Paul and Chloe believed they could steal my career with paperwork, but they forgot something. A career does not live on paper. It lives in the trust of the clients. And that trust is something they were never worthy of owning. Tonight, I will sleep deeply, because tomorrow the 32 desperate phone calls I promised you about will finally begin ringing. The circle is about to close, and satisfaction will belong to those who stood with integrity. Monday morning. I sat in my new office with a cup of black coffee, no sugar. The phone rested quietly on the wooden desk, silent, like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. I had already sent every piece of evidence of Paul's embezzlement to the board of directors and the company's largest creditors. I had also filed a formal request to freeze the house since it had been illegally mortgaged. At exactly 9:15, the desk began to vibrate. The first call, Paul. I let it ring until it stopped. The fifth call, still Paul. By the 10th call, it was Chloe. I answered, but said nothing, only listening. Robert, what have you done? Why was my card declined at the grocery store? Chloe screamed, her voice shaking with humiliation. Creditors are standing at the front door. They are trying to repossess Paul's car. You have to unlock the accounts right now. I hung up without saying a word. The phone kept vibrating violently on the desk. Call 15. Call 20. Then call 30. Paul started sending frantic messages, shifting from threats to desperate begging. Dad, please, I am begging you. They are going to send me to prison. I just had a little bad luck. You cannot be this cruel. I am your only son. I looked at the messages, my heart cold as winter stone. When they threw me out of the house on my birthday night, did they remember I was their husband and father? The 32nd call came as the sun was setting. I turned on the speaker. Paul's sobbing voice filled the room, mixed with Chloe's shouting and the voices of repossession agents in the background. Dad, please. They are sealing the house. I have nowhere to go. I took a deep breath. My voice echoed calmly through the empty office. Paul, you called me a pathetic old failure. You said my time was over. So why would a successful man like you need to beg a failure? You lost the only person who would have helped you the moment you chose to betray me. There is no we here anymore. There is only you and the consequences you created. He cried out, his voice breaking. Are you just going to let me die like this? I am not abandoning you, I replied coldly. I am simply letting you stand on the same feet you used to kick me out of my own home. Goodbye, Paul. I ended the call. That was the final one. Outside the window, I watched tow trucks pulling away their luxury cars. Chloe stood in the yard with 2 suitcases beside her, her face stunned as if she still could not believe what had happened. That shining mansion, those bright lights, were now nothing more than cold concrete that no longer belonged to them. Justice does not always come from a courtroom. Sometimes justice is simply allowing greedy people to taste the same cruelty they once delivered to others. The circle had closed. And tonight I was the only one who still had a real home to return to. A home built on truth, not on deception. 1 year later, I sat on the porch of a small but elegant villa that I designed and built with my own hands. Hendricks Renovations had become a leading company in the heritage restoration field. Half of my Uncle Thomas's land had been sold, giving me complete financial freedom. The remaining money I used to establish a scholarship fund for construction students who come from difficult backgrounds. I later heard that Chloe was now working at a roadside diner in another state. She serves the very people she once would not even look at. Paul is currently going through rehabilitation and working manual labor jobs to slowly pay off his debts. I do not hate them, but I will never go back. Some doors once closed should never be opened again. I watched the sun slowly setting behind the city's new buildings. Life has taught me one simple truth. It is never too late to start again. You can lose every possession you have, but if you keep your dignity and your strength, you can rebuild everything. What do you think about my journey? Do you believe I should forgive my son? Let me know your thoughts below. Do not forget to press like and share if this story gave you strength. I am Robert, and this is Dad's Real Life Revenge. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I smiled and took a sip of tea. The future ahead felt wide open and peaceful, because now I know that every brick I place from this moment forward will be a brick built on truth. Don't talk to him. He's just our butler. The words slipped lightly from Jessica's mouth, but they cut through the warm Thanksgiving dinner like a knife. I froze in place, the tray of red wine trembling slightly in my hands. 35 guests, wealthy neighbors, and my son's business partners fell silent all at once. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if I were an unwanted stain on their expensive carpet. I glanced at Marcus, my only son. He avoided my eyes, slowly rotating the crystal glass in his hand. Instead of standing up for the father who raised him, he stepped closer, leaned toward my ear, and whispered in a cowardly tone, "Dad, please don't embarrass us. Just go along with it, okay?" The blood in my veins seemed to freeze. In this house, I was no longer a father, no longer a grandfather, and certainly no longer a person. I was just an old piece of furniture, a ghost lurking in the corner of the room there, only to serve the illusion of their glamorous life. I suddenly laughed out loud because the man who was paying their mortgage and their credit cards was about to teach them a very expensive lesson. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. Grab a snack, sit back, and remember the people in these stories always had every chance to do the right thing. They simply chose not to. Leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. You're going to like it here. My name is James. I'm 65 years old. 10 years ago, after my wife passed away, I sold my chain of auto repair shops and gathered everything I owned so I could move in with my son. Marcus and Jessica kept saying they wanted to take care of me in my old age. They painted a picture of a happy three-generation family living together in a spacious mansion worth $1,200,000. But the reality was a painful slap in the face. What they didn't know or chose to forget was that I was the one who signed the check to buy this house. They didn't know that the balance in my bank account was still growing every day, with nearly $4 million from smart investments. They saw me in the gray butler's uniform that Jessica forced me to wear, and they assumed I had nothing but dependents. Jessica was an ambitious and vicious woman. She had established a kind of military regime inside the house, where I was pushed down to live in the damp basement next to the laundry room. Every morning I had to wake up at 5 to prepare breakfast, polish the floors, and do all the chores a professional housekeeper would demand a high salary for. But to them I was free labor. At today's party, the humiliation reached its peak. I watched Jessica laughing with her upper-class friends, proudly showing off a new handbag she had bought, using the supplementary credit card connected to my account, while introducing me as some lowly stranger. Every time I tried to speak with my grandchildren, Emma and Jake, Jessica would quickly step in. She didn't want me contaminating the perfect world she had created for them. The pain didn't come from being humiliated in front of strangers. It came from Marcus's silence. My son, the child I once stayed up all night caring for when he was sick, was now looking at his father like a burden that needed to be hidden. He enjoyed the luxury funded by my money, yet felt ashamed of my presence. I turned and walked into the kitchen, placing the wine tray on the marble counter. The shame I had felt moments earlier slowly faded, replaced by a chilling calm. When your self-respect has been stripped away completely, there is nothing left to fear. I glanced at the large mirror hanging in the hallway and straightened the collar of my butler's uniform. They thought I was a senile old man, someone with nowhere to go, clinging to their mercy. They were wrong. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through the bank notification that had just arrived. Total assets, $3,782,000. Enough money to buy 10 houses like this one and wipe the arrogance off Jessica's face in a single move. This little game of pretending to be their butler had gone on long enough, and I was starting to grow tired of the role. They believed they held my life in the palm of their hands, but in reality I was the one holding their financial oxygen. One click, that was all it would take, and all that glittering luxury outside would collapse like a sandcastle before the tide. Chapter 2 will expose the rot inside this million-dollar house. It will focus on the sharp contrast between the glamorous surface and the cruelty hidden in the basement, where James is treated like an invisible man while pushing the audience's anger to its peak as the Sunset Manor scheme begins to emerge. The party ended when the clock struck midnight. The last guests left with satisfied smiles, offering Jessica their compliments for a perfect evening and for having such a devoted butler. The moment the front door slammed shut, the smile on Jessica's face vanished, instantly replaced by the cold expression I knew so well. She tossed a dirty napkin at me and snapped that I should clean up the mess in the living room before I was allowed to go to bed. I worked in silence. At 65, my joints were no longer as flexible as they used to be, but I still bent down to pick up every crumb of cookie and wiped every streak of red wine from the hardwood floor. The master bedroom upstairs once belonged to me, the place where my wife and I had dreamed of a peaceful old age together. Now it was the territory of Jessica and Marcus. And me. I walked down the narrow, steep, dim staircase that led to the basement. My room was next to the furnace and the washing machine. It was so small it barely held a single bed and an old wardrobe. There was no window, no fresh air, only the constant rumble of the washing machine through the night and the damp smell of the earth. Jessica called it a space-saving solution, but I knew the truth. She simply wanted to push me out of sight so I wouldn't ruin the elegant image of the house. The next morning I woke up to Jessica pounding on my door. She stood there with her hands on her hips, ordering me to take Emma and Jake to school because her car was in the shop. As I held my grandchildren's hands and walked them to the car, I leaned in about to hug them the way I always did. But Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, suddenly stepped back. She looked at me with frightened eyes and said quietly, "Mom said we're not allowed to stay too close to you. She said you're a scary servant, and that your brain is broken." A child's words can cut deeper than any knife. Jessica hadn't just turned me into a servant, she was poisoning my grandchildren's minds, turning me into a monster in the eyes of the people I loved most. She was planting the idea that I was a confused old man, someone whose mind was failing so they would never respect me. It was the most refined cruelty a person could commit, stealing a grandfather's place in his grandchildren's hearts. They thought I was an old piece of furniture that needed to be thrown away. What they didn't know was that I held the combination to the very safe they had been dreaming about their entire lives. That afternoon, while I was cleaning the hallway on the second floor, I accidentally overheard a heated argument coming from Marcus's office. I was about to walk away, but the name Sunset Manor slipping from Jessica's mouth made me stop. I hid behind the thick wooden door and held my breath as I listened. "You have to sign this application," Marcus Jessica hissed through clenched teeth. "We can't keep him here forever. He's starting to lose his mind. Yesterday he even broke the Ming vase in the living room. Do you know how much that vase was worth?" Marcus hesitated. "But that's my dad. He paid for this house, Jessica. We can't just shove him into a nursing home when he's still perfectly healthy." "That's our money now," Marcus Jessica snapped coldly. "Just look at it, the joint account is running dry. If we send him to Sunset Manor, we can declare him legally incompetent. Once that happens, all of his investment portfolios and savings accounts will belong to us legally. I've already done the research. Sunset Manor is a very discreet place. They have their ways of making sure old men like him never walk out and cause trouble again." My chest tightened as I heard the long silence from my son. That silence hurt more than any insult. Marcus was thinking. He was weighing my entire life's fortune against his duty as a son. Then he sighed a sigh of surrender. "All right. But we have to do it carefully. We'll need a doctor to confirm early-stage dementia." Her words cut through the air like a blade. They were planning to use the very money I had spent my entire life building, to lock me away in a prison for the elderly, a place where I would be forgotten until the day I died. To them, I wasn't a father who deserved care. I was a financial obstacle that needed to be removed. Jessica's shameless cruelty had reached a level that could no longer be tolerated, and Marcus's cowardice erased the last trace of affection I still had for him. I quietly walked down the stairs, my hands trembling with rage, yet my mind strangely clear. A plan was already beginning to take shape. They wanted to play games about legal competency. They wanted control over my finances. Fine. I would show them exactly where the true power of money really lies. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to Harold, my longtime lawyer and closest friend. "Harold, I need you to prepare a few documents. It's time to activate the backup plan. And remember, keep everything quiet until the very last moment." I looked out through the small basement window where the only thing visible was the feet of people walking back and forth along the sidewalk. I had lived in the shadows for too long, endured too much, hoping that one day my son would wake up and realize what he was doing. But today that hope died. I was no longer a forgiving father. I was a millionaire protecting what belonged to me. Would Marcus choose his wife, or the father who raised him? The answer will shock you with the cruelty of people blinded by greed. Follow my story until the end, and leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the narrow single bed listening to the washing machine rumble and the laughter of Marcus and Jessica upstairs. They were opening an expensive bottle of champagne, probably celebrating the fact that their Sunset Manor plan was about to become reality. What they didn't realize was that every sip they drank tonight would become a bitter debt they would pay for the rest of their lives. My quiet revenge had officially begun, and the first card I was about to play would be the one that would make them drop to their knees in shock. They thought they were cornering me. In truth, they were only building the walls of their own prison. This game was no longer about humiliation. It was about justice. And the justice of a man who has nothing left to lose is the most terrifying kind of justice there is. Chapter 3 will mark James's transformation from a man who endured everything into a calm, calculating hunter. We will focus on the sharp contrast between James's quiet composure in his lawyer's office and the almost ridiculous chaos that erupts when Jessica suddenly finds that her lifeline has been cut off. On Monday morning, I didn't wake up at 5 to prepare breakfast like usual. Instead, I put on the most expensive custom-tailored suit I owned one. I had carefully hidden in a suitcase under my bed for the past 3 years. When I stepped into the living room, Jessica was standing there in her silk pajamas, her face still sleepy and irritated. She was about to yell, demanding to know why breakfast wasn't ready, but the words caught in her throat the moment she saw me. I was no longer the sluggish old butler. I stood straight, shoulders squared, my eyes cold like a general before battle. Without saying a word, I walked straight toward the door. "Dad, where are you going?" Marcus called after me, his voice confused. "What are you trying to do? Start a rebellion?" I simply gave a faint smile, the kind of smile he would soon learn was the warning sign of a financial catastrophe. I drove my old car to Harold's office building downtown. When I stepped into the room filled with the rich scent of oak wood and leather-bound documents, Harold greeted me with a firm handshake. "James," he said, studying my face, "I've been waiting for this call from you for 3 years. You've been far too patient." "Let's begin, Harold," I replied calmly. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every piece of legal documentation. Legally speaking, the house Marcus and Jessica were living in was entirely in my name. The $8,000 monthly allowance they received was actually an automatic transfer from my trust fund, the platinum credit card Jessica used for her extravagant shopping. It was simply an authorized card under my account. First, I said, cut off the supply line. I instructed Harold to notify the bank to immediately stop all automatic transfers into Marcus's account. Next, cancel every authorized credit card. And finally send them an official notice terminating their right to occupy the property. They would have 30 days to move out, unless they could pay market rent. $4,500 a month. Harold looked at me with quiet admiration. "So you're going all in?" "They think I'm a stray dog they took in," I said calmly. "What they don't realize is that I'm the one holding the winning hand." While I sat there, sipping black coffee with Harold, the storm was already beginning to hit the $1,000,000 house. I could almost picture it. Jessica standing at the counter of a luxury fashion boutique holding designer dresses worth thousands of dollars. She would hand over her card with that familiar smug expression, and then the cashier would look at the screen and shake her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined." Her shamelessness was astonishing. Even when cornered, she still tried to strike back with the old dementia card. But what she didn't know was that every word she said from this point on was being recorded by the pen clipped to my shirt pocket. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it would really help if you hit like and subscribe. 97% of people never do. But that's what keeps this entire channel going. I smiled a cold, chilling smile. "Don't worry about my mind, Jessica. Worry about how you're going to pay $4,500 in rent next month. Either you start looking for a smaller apartment, or you'll be out on the street." I turned and headed toward the staircase leading down to the basement. But halfway there I stopped and added, "Oh, and one more thing. Starting today I won't be making breakfast anymore. You'd better learn how to use the stove, if you can still afford the gas bill." That night, instead of the sound of the washing machine, I heard a violent argument erupting from the master bedroom. Jessica was blaming Marcus for failing to control his father, while Marcus was desperately trying to figure out how to keep their finances afloat. They were tearing into each other like animals trapped inside a glass cage. I lay on my narrow single bed and felt a strange sense of peace. This was only phase 1. They thought losing money was the worst thing that could happen. What they didn't realize was that the truth about my $4,000,000 fortune would be the thing that would truly destroy them. Tomorrow, the family meeting I had been waiting for would finally take place. It would be the day every mask was torn away, and the parasites would be forced to face the brutal reality they had created for themselves. Would Marcus fall to his knees and beg his father for forgiveness? Or would Jessica play her final card and try one last time to send James to a nursing home? The ultimate confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 4 is the moment of judgment. I will focus on the planned stair-step reveal technique, turning the living room into a courtroom where James stands as the supreme judge. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the house was thick with hostility. Jessica and Marcus no longer had their usual polished appearance. They sat at the dining table with dark circles under their eyes and stacks of unpaid bills piled in front of them. When I walked in, Jessica didn't scream this time. She looked at me the way a snake looks just before it strikes. She pushed a sheet of paper across the table toward me. It was a psychiatric evaluation request stamped by a private clinic, a place I was certain she had bribed with the last bit of money she had left. "You've gone too far, James," Jessica said, her voice trembling with anger, though she tried to sound triumphant. "We've already contacted Sunset Manor. They'll be here tomorrow morning to take you for treatment. If you're smart, you'll give us $5,000 right now to pay off these debts, and maybe I'll consider arranging a nicer room for you there." Marcus stared down at the floor and muttered weakly, "Dad, this is for your own good. You're losing control, and we need to protect the family's assets." I didn't respond. Instead, I slowly placed a black leather briefcase on the table. I opened the lock and the sharp click echoed through the silent room like the sound of a gun being cocked. I pulled out the first document. They thought I was a stray dog they had taken in, but they had no idea I was the one holding the winning hand. "This," I said, placing the paper on the table, "is the certificate of land use rights and home ownership. You say you want to protect the family's assets. Then take a good look at who the sole owner of this $1.2 million house really is. Not Marcus. Not Jessica. Me, James Pierce. And this morning I filed an eviction request with the court." Jessica's face drained of color. She grabbed the document with trembling hands, her expression shifting from pale to ghost white. Marcus's mouth fell open. But when we bought the house, you said it was a gift to us," he stammered. "A gift of use, not ownership," I replied coldly. "And that privilege ended the moment you turned your father into a basement butler. But that's not all." I pulled out the second document. "These are detailed statements from 3 different banks. My current total balance is $3,782,000. For the past 3 years, I've spent more than $300,000 just to maintain your ridiculous, extravagant lifestyle. I'm not some confused old man who needs financial protection. I'm the man who has been feeding this rotten family while the two of you played dress-up as high society." Silence filled the room. Jessica stared at the unbelievable numbers on the bank statement. The greed in her eyes suddenly transformed into a nauseating display of fake remorse. She tried to reach out and touch my hand, but I pulled away. Dad, Marcus stammered, his voice breaking. "We didn't know. We're truly sorry. We'll make it right. We'll move you back to the master bedroom immediately." I looked at my son and felt something deeper than anger. Pity. "You're not sorry because you mistreated me," I said calmly. "You're sorry because you accidentally mistreated a millionaire." And now I continued, "Here's the final card." I placed the recorder on the table and pressed play. Jessica's cold voice filled the room. "We can declare him legally incompetent. Once that happens, his entire investment portfolio will belong to us. Sunset Manor will make sure he never walks out and causes trouble again." Jessica collapsed into her chair, the color draining from her face. Marcus looked at his wife as if he were seeing a stranger, but I knew he was just as guilty through his silence. "You were planning to use my own money to lock me in a nursing home?" I asked. Every word landed like a stone on their chests. "You think my mind is broken? No, my mind is perfectly clear. Clear enough to record this betrayal. I've already sent that recording along with evidence of elder abuse to my lawyer and the police. If you've listened this far, do us one small favor. It only takes a second. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it means a lot to this channel." Jessica suddenly jumped to her feet, screaming like someone losing her mind. "You can't do this. You're his father. You can't throw us out onto the street." I stood up and calmly gathered my papers. There was no warmth left in my eyes for this woman. "I'm not throwing you onto the street," I said quietly. "I'm simply giving you the freedom you've always wanted. Freedom from my support. Freedom to earn your own living." I looked at Marcus one last time. "Your car will be repossessed this afternoon. Your credit cards are dead. And by the end of the weekend, the locks on this house will be changed. You have 48 hours to pack your things." Then I turned and walked up the stairs, not down to the basement, but straight into the master bedroom. For the first time in 3 years, I walked like the true owner of this house. Downstairs, the shouting and crying erupted again. But this time it didn't bother me. The game was over, the masks had fallen, And justice, late though it was, had been delivered with the cold precision of numbers. What do you think about the way James turned the tables? Will Jessica accept defeat? Or is she planning one last move during those final 48 hours? The truth revealed in the final chapter may make you rethink the true value of family. This final chapter will be a cleansing of James's soul and a fitting sentence for the greedy. We will end this journey with a feeling of peace, powerful and well-earned. 48 hours passed like a quiet purge. The mansion that once echoed with the fake laughter of upscale parties was now filled only with the sound of packing tape sealing cardboard boxes and the tired echoes of arguments. Jessica, the woman who once treated me like a ghost in the basement, chose the most cowardly path. Instead of kneeling down to apologize and ask for mercy, she packed up the last of her designer belongings and disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving behind a divorce paper for Marcus. Greed had been the only glue keeping her there. And when the money stopped flowing, she vanished like smoke. Marcus stood in the empty living room watching the taxi that carried his wife away. He looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped under the weight of reality. Without credit cards, without protection, he was just a middle-aged man with no real survival skills. I walked down the stairs this time wearing a simple but neatly pressed shirt. I didn't look at him with anger, but with a strange calmness. Marcus looked up, his voice hoarse. "Dad, I've lost everything. She's gone. What am I supposed to do now?" I poured a glass of water and placed it on the oak table that I had paid for with my own hands. "You haven't lost everything, Marcus," I said quietly. "You still have your hands, and you still have a name that hasn't been written in the black book of the law. I won't throw you out onto the street immediately, but you will live in the basement." Marcus stared at me in shock. I continued firmly. "You'll stay in the room next to the washing machine. You'll get a job, any job, and you'll pay me $2,000 in rent every month. If you're late, even one day, the door will be locked. If you complain once, you're out. This is the only way you'll find the identity of the man you lost during those years of blind indulgence." For the first time in many years, I saw Marcus cry. Not the fake tears of manipulation, but the tears of a child who had finally realized how terribly wrong he had been. Without saying a word, he picked up his suitcase and walked down to the basement, the place that had once been my home. I returned to the master bedroom and opened the windows wide, letting the sunlight pour in. I took out the photograph of my wife and placed it carefully on the dresser. I had kept my promise to her. I didn't allow our son to become completely ruined, but I also refused to let myself be trampled. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more hard-earned lessons about dignity, family, and the true cost of betrayal. My story may make many people angry, but it carries a harsh truth about life. Respect is not something you can simply grant yourself, it has to be earned. And sometimes, in order to protect love, you must learn to use the firmness of money and the power of the law. To those of you who have followed this story, I want to share a few lessons from a man who has lived nearly an entire lifetime. First, kindness without boundaries only feeds the ungrateful. Never confuse compassion with weakness. The moment you allow someone to cross the line of your self-respect, you are teaching them how to trample on you. Second, money is only a tool, but the way you use it reveals your true character. Jessica and Marcus saw the numbers, but they were blind to the value of the man who created them. Never bite the hand that feeds you, because when that hand closes into a fist, the price you pay will be total collapse. Finally, family is meant to be a place of love, not exploitation. $1 million mansion can never become a home if it is built on lies and cruelty. I looked down at the garden where Emma and Jake were playing together. I had reclaimed my right to be their grandfather. I will teach them the value of hard work, the importance of gratitude, and the truth that respect is not something you can simply claim, it must be earned. My name is James, and this is the story of my justified revenge on Dad's real-life revenge. Thank you for listening and staying with me until this final moment. Remember this in life: you can choose to be anyone, but choose to be a person of character. I'll see you again in the next stories. Just one seat at the graduation ceremony showed me exactly where I stood in my own family. It began with a phone call I was never supposed to overhear, and ended with a silence so heavy it crushed everything inside me. For 17 years, I had never missed a single milestone in Jasmine's life. Today was her graduation day at Howard University. I woke up at 5 in the morning. I carefully ironed my best shirt. I slowly tied the necktie Jasmine had given me for my birthday 3 years ago. I was proud. I was happy. I truly believed I was the luckiest father in the world. But my world collapsed right there in the entrance hall. Diane walked toward me with a cold expression on her face. She would not even look me in the eyes. She handed me a small piece of paper and whispered in a quiet but merciless voice, "You should sit in the backup seats at the back. The front row belongs to Marcus. Jasmine needs graduation photos with her real father. Having you there would ruin the perfect family picture." Her words stabbed straight into my chest. I stood frozen among the crowd. I looked down at the ticket in my hand. Seat 15. The very last row. The place reserved for unwanted guests. The place hidden behind the bright stage lights. Up front, Jasmine was smiling brightly in her graduation gown. She threw her arms around Marcus, the man who had not paid a single dollar in child support for 17 years. The man who only showed up after all the hard work was already done. "Dad, I did it!" Jasmine shouted happily. And she was not talking to me. I stood there, holding a bouquet of deep red roses. I had handpicked every single flower for my daughter. Without realizing it, I squeezed the stems tighter and tighter. Sharp thorns pierced deep into my skin. Warm blood trickled down, slowly, soaking through the silver wrapping paper. But that physical pain meant nothing compared to the humiliation tearing through my soul. Had I really spent my entire life raising a child with my own blood, sweat, and sacrifice, only to be treated like a stranger in the end? Welcome to Dad's Revenge Real Life. Don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. You are going to love it here. Betrayal does not always come like a slap across the face. Sometimes it comes when the people you love ask you to step aside so someone else can enjoy the rewards of your sacrifice. I turned around and walked away. I left behind their fake laughter and hollow happiness. The thunderous applause echoing through the halls of Howard University sounded unbearable to my ears. I sat alone on an ice-cold stone bench outside the campus. The blood on my palms had already dried into dark stains. Memories from the last 17 years came flooding back like a slow-moving film, crushing my chest with every passing second. Jasmine was 7 years old that year. She came home sobbing because other children mocked her crooked teeth. Seeing my little girl cry tore me apart inside. Diane looked at me and sighed. Braces at that time cost more money than we could possibly afford. But I promised my daughter I would give her the best life I could. And I kept that promise. That was when my endless nights at the frozen warehouse began. My shift started at 10 at night and ended at 6 the next morning. I carried heavy boxes weighing dozens of pounds inside temperatures below freezing. My body trembled constantly. My fingers ached every time the weather changed. My back hurt so badly there were mornings when I could barely stand upright. But every month when I saw the savings growing little by little, I smiled. My love for this family was never built on sweet words. It was written in cold numbers on bank statements. Numbers bought with my sweat and blood. I denied myself everything so Diane and Jasmine could live comfortably and never feel inferior to anyone else. I believed my sacrifices were building a strong and loving home. But I was wrong. I was building a magnificent castle on sand. And sand always washes away. Today's betrayal was not sudden. It had been growing quietly for 17 years, fed by my own silence and tolerance. They had become so used to receiving my sacrifices that they no longer saw them as sacrifices at all. To them, my pain had become normal, expected. If you have ever felt taken for granted after giving someone everything, you had hit the like button. I slowly stood up. Then I threw the blood-stained bouquet of roses into a trash can beside the road. My patience had finally reached its limit. Did they really think I would continue sacrificing myself quietly in the shadows forever? No. My plan to reclaim justice began at that exact moment. The train of their perfect lives was about to crash downhill, the second the silent driver me finally let go of the wheel. I drove back to our house. My mind was completely numb, but my chest burned with rage. For 17 years I had lived inside a world built on cruel contradictions. I finally realized that I had only ever been the silent worker behind the curtain while someone else played the hero making empty promises. When Jasmine was 14, she dreamed of joining the city's professional ballet academy. The tuition for that prestigious arts program was outrageously expensive. Marcus showed up one evening carrying a bright red rose. He smiled confidently and promised Jasmine he would pay every cent of her tuition. Jasmine nearly exploded with happiness. She threw her arms around him, took pictures together, and posted them all over social media. Thousands of people liked the photo beneath the caption, "The best dad in the world." But 3 days later, the tuition bill arrived at our house. Marcus blocked Diane's phone number. Then he disappeared, without a trace. I was the one who quietly pushed my only motorcycle to a pawn shop and sold it to pay for Jasmine's classes. For an entire year, I walked to work through rain, snow, and freezing winds because I no longer had a vehicle. Jasmine never knew the truth. She still believed the money came from Marcus. And I stayed silent because I did not want to destroy the image of her biological father in her heart. My sacrifices had slowly turned me into air inside that house. And air is invisible. Nobody notices air until they start suffocating. Diane and Jasmine were always dazzled by Marcus's flashy promises and fake charm. They treated my sweat, exhaustion, and money as something ordinary, something expected. When Marcus bought a cheap bracelet, they treasured it like priceless gold. When I provided an entire stable life, they treated it as nothing more than the duty of a servant. This injustice had to end. Marcus's fake brilliance and their endless ingratitude had pushed me to the edge. They had no idea that the true face behind all those promises was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible. And this was only the beginning. The breaking point came when Jasmine received her acceptance letter to Howard University. The tuition was an enormous burden. And just like every other time, Marcus appeared right on cue. He promised he would take care of everything. But 1 week before enrollment, he suddenly vanished again. He sent a short message claiming his investments had failed and that he was bankrupt. Jasmine cried until her eyes were swollen. Diane nearly lost her mind with panic. And once again I stepped in to carry the weight they could not bear. I made the decision to withdraw every dollar from the retirement fund I had spent half my life building. That money was supposed to protect me in old age. My hands trembled as I signed the withdrawal papers, but my heart felt strangely calm. I believed this sacrifice would finally prove the depth of my unconditional love. I believed they would finally understand who had truly stood beside them whenever storms came crashing down. I was wrong. That retirement fund bought me nothing except a betrayal so cruel it had been planned long before I ever discovered it. 1 week before the graduation ceremony, I came home earlier than usual because of severe back pain. The house was quiet. Then I heard whispers coming from the master bedroom. It was Diane. She was speaking to Marcus on the phone. I froze in the hallway outside the door. Diane lowered her voice and said softly, "Don't worry. Everything is going exactly as planned. Once Jasmine graduates, we can finally push that troublesome old man out of the family picture. Without his money, Jasmine never would have finished college anyway. But now she has a good job in the city. He's no longer useful to us." My entire body went numb. Then Diane continued, "We'll move into the new apartment Jasmine rented. You'll finally get to stand beside your daughter as the official father at all the high-class parties. And don't worry about this house. I'll force him to sign it over to me." Every word poured into my soul like freezing water. My ears rang. My heart stopped beating. The woman I had loved and protected for 17 years saw me as nothing more than a machine for money. They had waited for me to bleed myself dry so they could throw me away like a worthless rag the moment they no longer needed me. Do not scream so people can see your pain. Stand up and walk away the moment the graduation ceremony of exploitation begins. Hit like if you agree. That was the moment my patience finally died. The fragile contract called family had already been torn apart by their own hands. I did not cry. I smiled coldly in the darkness. They wanted to erase me from their perfect picture. Fine. But before I stepped out of that picture, I was going to burn the entire canvas to the ground. That night I began preparing a graduation gift that Diane, Jasmine, and Marcus would remember for the rest of their lives. I walked out of the halls of Howard University in complete silence. I did not wait for the graduation ceremony to end. I did not look back at their glowing smiles even once. That night I sat alone in my office. The room was completely dark. The pain inside me had disappeared. All that remained was a terrifying level of clarity. I picked up my phone and made 3 calls before dawn. The first call was to the property management company. I was the sole leaseholder for the luxury apartment Jasmine had rented downtown. In a cold and steady voice, I requested the immediate termination of the lease agreement. I agreed to forfeit the security deposit. The apartment would be reclaimed by the end of the month. Jasmine would no longer have a beautiful place to move into with her wonderful biological father. The second call was to the bank. I ordered every supplementary credit card belonging to Diane and Jasmine to be frozen immediately. For 17 years, they had used my money for designer clothes, luxury dinners, and glamorous lifestyles. As of tonight, that river of money had officially dried up. I was no longer the devoted husband. I was now a man, enforcing ownership over what belonged to him. The final call was to a real estate agency. The house we lived in had always belonged entirely to me long before the marriage. I instructed the agent to sell it immediately for 10% below market value. My only condition was speed. I wanted every legal procedure completed within 2 weeks. They thought I was just a foolish man who worked himself to death without asking questions. They believed they could drain every drop of my finances and casually throw me away afterward. They were wrong. I was the one who built their fake paradise with my own hands, and I could destroy it just as easily. This war had only begun, and they were still celebrating their victory, without realizing the ground beneath them was already collapsing. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rises, Diane and Jasmine will receive their first brutal slap from reality. Are you curious to see how they react when they realize the gold mine they despised has officially closed forever? Stay tuned for the next chapter to witness the full force of this reckoning. The next morning, Diane and Jasmine returned home just after sunrise. I was sitting calmly in the living room reading the newspaper and sipping a cup of bitter coffee. They walked inside, looking exhausted, but their smiles still filled the room. The moment Diane saw me, she started complaining. She grumbled that Marcus had once again forgotten his wallet during their celebration dinner at a 5-star restaurant the night before. Jasmine immediately defended her biological father. A great man like Marcus should not have to worry about petty money problems, she said proudly. I did not say a single word. I simply smiled. Their awakening began less than an hour later. On her way to work, Diane stopped at her usual Starbucks for one of her expensive coffees. Casually, she swiped the supplementary credit card I had given her years ago. Beep. The payment machine rejected it. The cashier gave her an awkward smile. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card has been declined. Diane frowned in irritation and tried again. Declined. Again. This time, panic flashed across her face. Seconds later, my phone rang. The moment I answered, Diane exploded with fury. Lucas, what did you do to my account? Unlock the card. Right now I'm standing here humiliating myself in this coffee shop. My voice remained perfectly calm. There's nothing wrong with the card. I canceled it. Starting today, you can pay for your perfect little life yourselves. Then I hung up before she could scream another word. At the exact same time, Jasmine received an urgent email from the property management company. The message informed her that the lease for her luxury apartment had been terminated immediately. She was required to remove all her belongings before the 31st of the month. That was when real panic finally began spreading through both of them. For the first time in years, they realized the invisible support system surrounding their lives was disappearing piece by piece. The glamorous mask they wore so proudly was slowly being ripped away layer after layer. But this was only a light appetizer before the real punishment began. Tonight's confrontation at the dinner table would expose every ugly truth completely. Did they really believe they could corner me so easily? Then they should prepare themselves for the final audit from the man they once called the troublesome old burden. That night, the family dinner table turned into a cold execution chamber. Diane and Jasmine stormed into the house with fury burning across their faces. They slammed their hands onto the table and shouted directly at me. Have you lost your mind, Lucas? How dare you freeze our cards and cancel Jasmine's apartment? Do you have any idea how humiliated we were today? I did not flinch. Slowly, I pushed a thick stack of documents across the table toward them. It was the most detailed financial audit they had ever seen in their lives. I looked directly at Jasmine. My voice was as cold as ice. For 17 years, this is the exact amount I spent on both of you. $1,240,000. Your braces. Your ballet academy tuition. Your expensive education at Howard University. Every single dollar came from my sweat and blood. I leaned forward slightly. Marcus made promises. I was the one who carried them out. I was the one who emptied his retirement fund so you could hold your head high beside your wealthy classmates. And yet at your graduation yesterday, both of you pushed me to seat 15 in the back row so a man who contributed nothing could stand in the spotlight. Diane let out a mocking laugh. So now you're counting every penny you spent on your wife and daughter. That's pathetic. This house belongs to me too. You can't treat us like this. Without changing my expression, I pulled out one final document. the property ownership papers, and the completed sale agreement. I looked directly into Diane's eyes. This house was entirely mine before we got married, and I already sold it. You have exactly 2 weeks to remove every belonging you own. The new owner takes possession on the 15th. Jasmine suddenly burst into tears. She stared at me with shock, fear, and desperation in her eyes. Dad, are you throwing me away? Are you still my father? Slowly, I stood up. I looked at the daughter I had once loved more than my own life. Then I answered in a low but unshakable voice. I'm not throwing you away, Jasmine. I'm simply returning you to the place you chose for yourself. The front row beside your biological father. The room went silent. You already planned to erase me from your family picture after graduation. I'm only helping you do it a little sooner. Diane and Jasmine stood frozen in place. Their faces turned pale. Not a trace of color remained. The brutal truth had completely shattered the fantasy they had been living in. But the punishment was still far from over, because the real question had not been answered yet. What would happen when their beloved hero Marcus finally had to face? Diane completely lost control. She screamed hysterically and tore the audit papers into pieces, scattering them across the table like falling ashes. Then she unleashed the cruelest insults she could think of. You're a controlling monster, Lucas. You want to destroy your own daughter's future over a single seat. You're selfish. I watched the shredded papers drift through the air. Inside me, there was nothing left to shake. Diane's rage only proved one thing. They were terrified. Terrified of reality finally arriving at their doorstep. Without saying another word, I walked into my room and returned with the suitcase I had already packed. My voice was calm, cold, and final. You have exactly 2 weeks to leave this illusion behind. Move out willingly or be forced out. Your choice. This house no longer has anything to do with me. Then I walked toward the front door. I did not look back at Jasmine's late tears or Diane's violent outburst echoing behind me. The night air in Annapolis was cold and fierce. I walked slowly down the familiar street leading toward the main road. And there, beneath the dim glow of a streetlight, I saw Marcus's polished luxury car parked at the corner. Marcus leaned casually against it, scrolling through his phone with a smug smile on his face. Maybe he was waiting for Diane to bring him the good news about the house transfer. Or maybe he was fantasizing about his glamorous future, beside a Howard University graduate daughter he had never spent a single dollar raising. This time I walked directly toward him first. The moment Marcus saw the suitcase in my hand, he straightened up nervously. I looked directly into the calculating eyes of the man who had betrayed me for 17 years. Then I smiled. The bill for your perfect family is finally coming due, Marcus. His expression instantly changed. The house is sold. The bank accounts are frozen. Jasmine's apartment is gone too. So starting tomorrow, you'll be the one paying for their glamorous lifestyle. I adjusted my grip on the suitcase and stepped closer. Good luck. Marcus's confident expression collapsed into pure shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I turned around and walked away without waiting for a response. The game of switched roles was finally complete. Now the man who made promises would have to carry the full weight of 2 ungrateful people with empty pockets. And without my money holding everything together, the true nature of their parasitic relationship would finally be exposed. The next 6 months would become a living hell that stripped every layer of fake love away one by one. How long do you think Marcus will stay loyal once the gold mine disappears forever? 6 months passed quickly. I moved to Annapolis and settled into a quiet little coastal town. I bought an old woodworking shop and started over from scratch. There were no more complaints from Diane. No more crushing financial pressure. My hands were now covered with sawdust paint stains and rough calluses from carving wood instead of bleeding from rose thorns. For the first time in many years, my soul finally found peace. Late one evening, my phone vibrated softly. A text message appeared from an unfamiliar number, but I immediately knew who it was. Jasmine. She sent me a screenshot of a bank transfer. $500. Below it was a short message. Dad, this is my first paycheck. I'm sending you a small part of it to repay what I owe you. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I hope you stay healthy. I stared silently at the screen for a long time. Surprisingly, I felt no hatred, no triumph either, only a strange sense of calm. For the first time in her life, Jasmine had begun to understand the value of hard work. She finally understood what it meant to earn money with sacrifice and exhaustion instead of taking it for granted. Through a few old acquaintances, I eventually learned what happened after I left. The truth revealed itself almost immediately. Just as I predicted, Marcus abandoned Diane within the very first week, after discovering she no longer had a house savings or financial security. He disappeared as quickly as he had once appeared. Marcus never wanted responsibility. He only loved comfort funded by someone else. Diane and Jasmine were forced to rent a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. For the first time in years, they had to face rent payments, utility bills, groceries, and financial stress completely on their own. But the greatest punishment was never poverty. The greatest punishment was forcing them to face reality without my silent protection standing behind them. Only after the glamorous curtain finally fell did they realize the man they looked down on had been the very person keeping them from collapsing into the abyss. Every debt of loyalty and betrayal had finally been settled. But my story does not end with revenge. Because inside this small woodworking shop lies the most important lesson I want to leave behind for all of you. Stay with me for the final reflections, because if you are also living through injustice, abandonment, or silent sacrifice, you may discover the path that finally sets you free. The soft scent of pine wood drifted through my small woodworking shop in Annapolis. The golden evening sunlight stretched across the handcrafted benches I had built with my own hands. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and quietly admired my work. After 17 long years, my journey had finally ended in a silence filled with dignity. I may have lost a fake family, but I finally found myself again. Standing inside this workshop, I learned 3 painful lessons about life. The first lesson is about self-worth. Never measure your value based on the approval of ungrateful people. The second lesson is about respect. Love without respect is nothing more than a cruel form of emotional parasitism. And the final lesson is about kindness. Never allow your kindness to become an unlimited free service. The more easily you sacrifice yourself, the more people begin to treat your pain as your obligation. I looked at the simple wooden chair I had just finished building. It stood firm and strong. It was not sitting in seat 15 behind anyone else's spotlight. It belonged on a stage built by my own hands. If people refuse to give you the seat you deserve, then build your own stage. Do not beg for pity. Do not tolerate humiliation just to preserve the illusion of a happy family. My story is a warning to everyone, silently sacrificing themselves in the dark. Your silence does not make selfish people grateful. It only feeds their greed. Be brave enough to walk away once your limits have been crossed. Join our community by hitting the like button and subscribing for more real, emotional, and hard-hitting family stories. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. I turned off the lights and closed the door to the workshop behind me. The streets of Annapolis were glowing beneath the night sky. And for the first time in many years, I walked forward feeling completely free. My real life was only beginning now. The air turned thick, heavy with the smell of money, when Oriana placed a sheet of paper on the table. It was a draft budget for the wedding, something I had never seen in my entire 69 years. A number at the bottom of the page made me narrow my eyes. $900,000. She did not even blink as she slid it toward me. Meanwhile, I sat there confused, unable to grasp what kind of problem had just appeared in front of me. Welcome back to Dad's Real Life Revenge. This is a very strange story. The groom's family demanding wedding money from the bride's side. Subscribe and leave a comment with the number 8 so we can begin this story together. I was sitting at Coastal Pearl, a restaurant where the sound of waves outside the balcony rolled in softly like the heartbeat of a storm slowly approaching. Across from me sat Oriana Whitfield, the future mother-in-law of my daughter. She looked like she had stepped straight out of a luxury magazine. Her hair was tied in a flawless high bun without a single strand out of place. The diamond ring on her finger was so large, I felt like it could anchor a small boat. But her eyes were different. Cold. Calculating. They were not the eyes of a woman about to become family. They were the eyes of a hunter measuring the weight of its prey. I took a sip of white wine. The sharp bitterness settled on my tongue. Oriana kept talking endlessly about her family lineage in Greenwich. About gala evenings at Yale. About traditional values that people like me, in her words, would never truly understand. My daughter Emma sat beside me. She held tightly to the hand of her fiancé Kane. Kane looked uneasy. He avoided looking at his mother. Instead, he stared down at his plate, as if searching for a way out. I looked at Emma. My daughter had always been a simple child. She never needed any of this. But Oriana did. She needed a stage where she could display her borrowed glamour. You see, in my line of business, you learn to read people by the way they treat the waiters. Oriana snapped at a young server simply because the wine was not cold enough. She used luxury like a weapon to crush the people around her. She glanced at my suit with quiet disdain. Emma lightly touched my leg under the table. At that moment, my phone vibrated once inside my pocket, a short reminder of a message. I looked at my daughter and noticed something different in her eyes. I knew Emma wanted a simple wedding dream with the man she loved. She had always been that kind of person. But the moment that draft appeared on the table, I knew it was a financial black hole waiting to swallow them whole. I smiled. The calm smile of a father who had lived through enough storms to recognize when another one was about to arrive. I looked straight into Oriana's deep blue eyes. Behind the expensive foundation on her face, I saw something chillingly empty. This story is not just about an extravagant wedding. It is about a battle for survival between sincerity and bottomless greed. Everything was only beginning, and I promise you the ending will make it impossible for you to look away from the screen. Oriana took a sip of sparkling water with a kind of aristocratic elegance that felt almost theatrical. She pushed the budget paper toward me. Her fingers carried the heavy scent of perfume and a pride she did not even try to hide. The number $900,000 was still sitting there. Was it a plan for a joyful day or a crushing financial burden for a young couple just starting their lives? The Whitfield family has its own standards, Silas, she began in a low but commanding voice. We come from Greenwich. We studied at Yale. We do not host cheap outdoor parties with barbecue and beer. This wedding represents the face of our family. I stayed silent. I let her talk. In business, the person who talks the most is usually the one who knows the least or the one trying to hide something. I watched Kane. The young man kept his head lowered. He would not look me in the eyes the way he had before. Something was not right. A groom should look happy, not like someone who is afraid of something. Oriana continued digging into the differences in social class. She talked about elite friends who would fly in from London and Paris. She talked about Kane marrying into a lower class. Unbelievable. She used that phrase so casually, as if my daughter were some discounted item her son was generously choosing to take home. So according to Whitfield tradition, the bride's family will cover most of the expenses. In other words, if my daughter wanted to match her son, she needed to make up the difference. Oriana tapped her finger lightly on the number $630,000. That was 70% of the total budget. She looked at me as if she were granting a privilege. I know you have a small construction company. I hope you have saved enough for Emma's big day. Do not let the girl embarrass herself in front of our friends. It was the tone of someone hollow inside. Truly wealthy and truly refined people at least understand the most basic manners. To me, it felt like an insult. At home, my daughter was treated like a treasure. Here she was being spoken of like a discounted product. I saw Emma gripping the edge of the tablecloth so tightly that her fingertips turned pale. That only fueled my anger even more. But it was still too early for me to understand the full picture. I looked again at the ring on Oriana's finger. It glittered under the restaurant lights, but to someone who had worked with all kinds of materials, something about it felt wrong. It was too perfect, too flashy, just like the woman wearing it. A display meant to hide something rotten underneath. She thought I was just a poor father worried about paying the bill. She thought she could scare a man who built his entire career from nothing by flashing the name Greenwich. Kane tried to raise his head, as if he wanted to say something, but one sharp glare from Oriana shut him down immediately. I felt a wave of sadness for him. A man who was supposed to become the pillar of his own family, yet he could not even stand up for himself in this moment. Maybe it all came from the manipulation of his mother. If my guess was right, she was using her own son like a puppet on a stage. She was turning this wedding into a business deal. I took a sip of cold water. The chill ran down my spine. I was about to speak when I felt another vibration from my pocket. Not a single short buzz like before. This time it came 3 times in a row. Another signal from Emma. My daughter looked at me with eyes that were trying to tell me something. Because the previous signal I had not even checked yet, I had been too busy listening to Oriana's endless monologue. I lowered my head and pulled out my phone. A series of messages appeared, all carrying the same words. I read the line over and over again. Dad, he is not the groom. She is the groom. I looked up. Oriana was still talking endlessly about a rare type of orchid that needed to be imported from the Netherlands. She looked flawless. But my daughter's words began echoing in my mind like an alarm bell. She is the groom. What did that mean? Cain was just a pawn, a tool she was using to enter my family. Her real target was not the wedding. It was my wallet. I took a slow, deep breath. The calm of a seasoned businessman returned to me. I glanced at Cain. The young man still kept his head down, his hands tightly clasped together. Now I understood his uneasiness. It was not anxiety about the wedding. It was the guilt of someone participating in a deception against the person he loved. Oriana seemed to notice my unusual silence. She tilted her head, a gesture of artificial concern. Mr. Silas, you seem deep in thought. I understand that $630,000 is not a small number for a construction man. But think about Emma's future. The girl deserves the very best. I smiled. It was the same smile I used during the most intense negotiations. Thank you for sharing the Whitfield family traditions, I said, my voice calm and steady. It has been very enlightening. She did not just want money for a wedding. She wanted control. She wanted to drain the people she considered beneath her. I realized Emma's foot was still touching mine under the table. I placed my hand over hers on the table. I wanted my daughter to know I had received the message, and I would not let anyone hurt her. Oriana raised an eyebrow. So we are agreed then. I need a deposit of $200,000 for the event planner tomorrow morning. They do not hold reservations long for strangers. She was rushing. A classic sign of a con artist when they sense their prey starting to hesitate. They push you into urgency so you do not have time to think. They want you to sign the check before you notice the cracks in their perfect mask. Let me think about it, I replied. I need to review the cash flow from my current projects. $1 million wedding deserves careful preparation, does it not? Oriana's eyes flashed with a hint of irritation. She was not used to being delayed, but she quickly recovered her polite expression. Of course. I will wait for your call tonight. Do not disappoint us. We stood up. Lunch ended with an awkward silence hanging in the air. When we stepped outside the restaurant, the sea breeze felt cold against my skin. I watched Oriana and Cain walk toward the luxury car waiting for them. I knew the battle had only just begun. Emma grabbed my arm as we walked toward the parking lot. Dad, I am sorry, she whispered. I pulled my daughter into a tight embrace. There is nothing to apologize for, Princess. I have seen everything I needed to see. Now I had a new mission. I needed to find out who Oriana Whitfield really was, and why Cain said she was the groom. The answer lay somewhere that her money could not hide. I took out my phone and dialed a number I had not called in years. Why would a mother be willing to use her own son as bait? And what terrible secret was Cain hiding about his family? The discoveries made by Detective Joe Russo would make you shiver at the cruelty of this woman. Oriana's car disappeared behind the line of trees. I stood there tasting the salt of the sea and the bitterness of betrayal. Emma slid into the passenger seat of my car. She was not crying. She simply stared straight ahead into the empty distance. A heavy silence filled the air. I did not start the engine right away. I needed to hear the truth. Dad, Cain tried to warn me, Emma finally said. Her voice was thin like a fragile thread. He loves me, but he is her slave. A slave of flesh and blood. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. The skin on my hands turned pale. Tell me about that message, I said firmly. Emma turned toward me. Her eyes were red. Cain said the Whitfield family is a lie. They have no trust fund. They have no mansion in Greenwich. Everything she wears, the car she drives, all of it is rented with the last dollars taken from her previous victims. She is not looking for a daughter-in-law. She is looking for a sponsor for her decaying luxury lifestyle. Cain has been manipulated since he was a child. She holds secrets about him. She threatens to destroy his life if he does not help her carry out this scheme. He calls her the groom because she is the one who decides every move. Cain is only a shadow. A shock ran down my spine. This was not a wedding. This was an armed robbery, except the weapons were marriage papers and empty promises. Oriana was a con artist. She used the emotions of young people to drain the parents who loved them. My anger slowly gave way to clarity. I remembered Cain's eyes in the restaurant. That silent plea now made sense. He wanted to escape, but Oriana's cage was too strong. He truly loved Emma. And because of that love, he risked everything to send her a warning under the table. I started the engine. The motor roared to life with determination. We will not let her win, I said. But we need proof. We need to know how many families this monster has passed through before reaching us. Emma looked at me, worry clear on her face. What are we going to do, Dad? They are professionals. They have good lawyers. They have perfect fake documents. I gently tapped my daughter's hand. They may have professionalism, but I have the truth. And I have old friends who never forget a debt. I drove toward the center of the city. In my mind, a plan was already forming. A plan not only to protect Emma, but also to bring justice for the people she had drained before us. Oriana thought she had found a wealthy and gullible builder. She did not know that builders are the people who know exactly how to tear down rotten structures from the foundation. I stopped the car in front of an old building. This was where Joe Russo worked, a former detective with a mind like a computer. If anyone could rip the mask off Oriana Whitfield, it would be him. Before stepping inside, I looked at Emma one last time. I promise you this wedding will still happen, but not the way she wants it to. It will be a wedding of freedom. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of Joe Russo's office. The familiar smell of old tobacco and worn leather hit my nose. Joe sat behind a desk buried under piles of files. He did not look up. He simply tapped a pencil against the desk in a steady rhythm. I had known Joe for 20 years back, when he was a detective with a reputation as a bloodhound who never gave up. Silas, Joe said, his voice rough like sand in his throat. You never come to see me unless someone is about to face serious trouble. I sat down across from him and placed Oriana's budget sheet on the desk. I need you to look into this woman, Oriana Whitfield. Joe picked up the paper, glanced at the number $900,000, and smirked. An expensive price for a wedding, but a cheap price to buy your freedom if you find out early enough. He turned to an old computer and began typing rapidly. The room fell silent, except for the steady spin of the ceiling fan and the pounding of my heart in my chest. I watched Joe's face closely. The wrinkles on his forehead tightened. His eyes narrowed behind thick glasses. A few minutes passed before a dry beep sounded. Joe rotated the screen toward me. Take a look, Silas. Whitfield is not her real name. An old identification photo appeared on the screen. The same face, but younger and sharper. Oriana Marie Lorella. That was her real name. Joe began reading through the information. She is not from Greenwich. She was born into a poor family on the outskirts of Ohio. No Yale. No aristocratic tradition. Just a long list of civil lawsuits and restraining orders. She is a performer, Joe said. Her specialty is marriage fraud. She targets wealthy fathers, men who love their daughters so much that they become blind. She uses her son as bait to gain access. Once the wedding deposits are transferred into shell accounts, she and the boy disappear without a trace. I felt my blood begin to boil. The humiliation at Coastal Pearl suddenly had its answer. She dared to use Emma's love as part of a filthy scam. She dared to mock my work, while she herself did not have a single honest dollar to her name. But there is something strange here, Joe suddenly said. He pointed at a red line on the screen. In the two most recent cases, her son Cain tried to contact the police. But she always escaped because of strict confidentiality agreements. She holds something over Cain. Something powerful enough to keep him obedient even while he hates her for it. Now I understood the desperation in Cain's eyes. He was not an accomplice. He was another prisoner trapped inside his mother's scheme. Joe pulled out a yellow folder from the bottom drawer. This is the case from Charlotte 3 years ago. A construction contractor family lost $2 million. The father collapsed and died of a stroke shortly after the scam was revealed. Oriana does not just steal money. She takes lives and destroys reputations. My hand tightened into a fist. I was not the contractor from Charlotte. I was Silas. And I was not going to let this story end the way she wanted. Joe looked at me, a sharp light flashing in his eyes. So, what is your plan? I stared at Oriana's photograph on the screen. A plan was forming. One that required the same level of ruthlessness she had shown my family. We will let her believe she is winning, I said quietly. We will let her reach for that $1 million. But that moment will be the end of Oriana Marie Lorella's career. Joe nodded. A rare smile appeared on his weathered face. I like the way you think, Silas. Let me contact a few old friends at the FBI. We will need more than just these old files. When I stepped out of Joe's office, darkness had already covered the city. Streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. I knew Oriana was probably sitting in her rented luxury apartment, sipping wine and dreaming about my money. What she did not know was that Detective Joe Russo had just opened a Pandora's box she would never want to see. But there was one detail Joe had discovered in those files that made me stop beside my car. There was a victim whose name never appeared in the official records. Someone who vanished after confronting Oriana. Who was that person? And why did Kane look terrified whenever he mentioned that name to Emma? The truth behind Oriana's crimes was deeper than we had imagined. Joe Russo flipped another page in the file. The soft rustle of paper in the quiet office sounded like fingernails scraping across wood. He slid another photograph toward me. This time it was not an identification photo. It was a candid shot taken inside a courthouse in Atlanta. Oriana stood there smiling, a victorious smile beside an older man who looked completely shattered. "Look closely," Silas Joe said. "This is her script. Charlotte, Atlanta, Naples. Every city is a different name. Every family is left in ruins. She never uses a gun. She uses marriage licenses. She convinces the victims to sign the checks willingly because they want to save face. They would rather lose the money than let the world know they were fools who got played." I stared at the list of victims. Construction families, self-made business owners. All of them looked like me. People who worked hard and loved their daughters too much. Oriana was not just a thief. She was a parasite. She drained financial resources and left behind emotional corpses. A chill crawled down my spine when I reached the notes about the case in Naples. One father took his own life after discovering the entire payroll fund of his company had been drained under the pretense of a wedding deposit in Italy. Oriana disappeared immediately afterward with $800,000 in cash. Not a trace. Not a goodbye. The cruelty went far beyond anything I had imagined. To her, destroying a human life was nothing more than another number on a balance sheet. I thought about Emma. If we had not realized the truth in time, my daughter would have been the next victim. She would have carried the pain of betrayal from the man she planned to marry. But what about Kane? I asked, my eyes still fixed on the file. Why does he stay with her? Joe sighed, as a thin ribbon of smoke drifted into the air. That is the darkest part. Oriana is not just his mother. She's the keeper of his secret. There was an accident 10 years ago. A hit and run. Oriana stepped forward and took the blame for Kane, but in reality she used it to put a permanent noose around his neck. Every time Kane tries to leave, she threatens to reopen the case. She turned a mother's protection into a lifelong slave contract. That is why Kane sent that message. He is trying to save Emma. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Neon lights flickered like watchful eyes in the darkness. I did not just feel anger. I felt a cold determination forming inside me. Oriana Whitfield, or Oriana Marie Lorella. This time she had chosen the wrong man to target. She thought I was an aging contractor who could be fooled by fancy words and high society names. She did not know that I had built the strongest foundations out of rubble. And I also knew how to bring down a rotten structure from the inside. "Joe," I said, without turning around, "I need a list of every surviving victim. We are not fighting this alone. We are bringing all her ghosts back at once." Joe nodded and reached for the phone. I knew the game had changed. Oriana was probably already planning the next dinner where she would demand the money transfer. She had no idea that dinner would be the last one she enjoyed in freedom. But just as I was about to leave, Joe called out, "Silas, there is one more thing. I just found the name of the victim who disappeared in Naples. You are not going to believe it. That person had a connection to Kane closer than anyone else. A truth that could completely change the way we see that young man. Was Kane truly an accomplice? Or was he the final card that could turn the entire game around?" I arranged to meet Kane in an empty parking lot near the harbor. The sea wind blew hard. The sound of metal chains striking the masts echoed like the shackles of a ghost ship. Kane stepped out from the shadows. He wore a black coat, the collar pulled high to hide his pale face. When he saw me, he froze. His eyes held fear mixed with a strange sense of relief. "I knew you would call, Kane," said his voice trembling. "Did you read Emma's message?" I walked closer and looked straight into his eyes. The eyes of someone trapped with no escape. "I read it," I replied. "And I also read the file about your mother. Or should I say Oriana Lorella?" Kane stepped back and leaned against the hood of a car. His whole body seemed to collapse like a house without a foundation. I am sorry, Silas. I truly love Emma. But she is a devil, she never lets me escape. She uses that accident from years ago to force me to perform this act with her again and again. I placed my hand on his shoulder. The steady weight of a builder's hand helped him stand upright again. Listen to me, Kane. You have two choices. One is to remain her puppet and watch Emma's life get destroyed. The other is to help me end this nightmare. You will not go to prison for the things she forced you to do. I have Joe Russo. I have evidence she does not know exists. I pulled a tiny recording device from my pocket. It was thin enough to hide beneath a shirt collar. I need you to wear this, I said. I need you to make her admit the $200,000 deposit. I need her to talk about the families in Charlotte and Naples. Kane stared at the recorder as if it were a ticking bomb. If she finds it, she will kill me, he whispered. I looked directly into his eyes. If you do nothing, you will kill yourself slowly every day when you look at Emma. Choose. Kane stayed silent for a long moment. Waves crashed loudly against the rocks. Then he took the device from my hand. His hands were no longer shaking. I will do it, he said firmly. I want to be free. I want to deserve Emma. If you have been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it would really help if you hit the like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it is what keeps this entire channel alive. I helped Kane hide the device inside his shirt. I showed him how to press the hidden activation button. We only have one chance, I warned him. Tomorrow night at the family dinner, when she asks me to sign the check, that is when you act. Use her own arrogance to lead her into the trap. Kane nodded. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there alone, feeling the restless pulse of the plan beginning to move. This was a gamble. If Kane betrayed me, I would lose everything. But I chose to believe the 6 words Emma had sent. I chose to believe that love could be stronger than the manipulation of a con artist. I returned to my car. My phone lit up with a message from Oriana. An address for a luxury restaurant tomorrow night. A sweet note about the bright future of our 2 families. She was still dreaming about the $1 million. She did not know the noose was slowly tightening around her own neck. But just as I was about to drive away, another black car slowly rolled out from the dark corner of the parking lot. It had been there the whole time. Had someone been watching our meeting? And if Oriana already knew about our plan, would Kane even survive long enough to walk into that dinner tomorrow night? The luxury restaurant was strangely quiet. Candlelight flickered across the polished silverware on the table. Oriana sat there in a deep red velvet dress. She looked like a queen waiting to receive tribute. Kane sat beside her. He wore the shirt where I had hidden the recorder. His face was stiff. I saw a bead of sweat sliding down his temple. Silas, you look tired, Oriana said sweetly. She raised her glass of wine. Perhaps preparing $1,050,000 has been exhausting for you. Do not worry. Once we become family, it will all be worth it. I looked straight into her eyes. I took out my checkbook and placed it on the table. I prepared the first $200,000 as you requested. But I do have a few questions about the wedding insurance fund you mentioned. Why is the beneficiary account registered to a company in Naples? Oriana froze for a fraction of a second. Then she laughed. A professional laugh. Oh, that is simply a legal structure for tax purposes. In Greenwich, we always optimize our financial flows. You would not want your money wasted on the government, would you? She pulled out a stack of invoices. All of them were fake bills from non-existent vendors. She enthusiastically described enormous costs for flowers, musicians, and private security teams. She had no idea that every word she spoke was being transmitted directly to Joe Russo and the investigators sitting inside a van in the parking lot. Suddenly, Kane spoke. His voice trembled slightly, but it was clear. Mom, do we really need that much cash? Emma's father has already been generous. Why not transfer the money directly to the contractors? Oriana's eyes instantly turned cold. She looked at her son, as if he were a traitor. Darling, you should focus on being a good groom. Leave financial matters to the adults. Then she turned back to me, trying to recover her calm expression. You see, young people sometimes fail to understand the value of discretion. I slid the check toward her. I had signed it, but I had not written the amount yet. I would like to hear again about Charlotte. You said your family has strong connections there. Will any of those friends attend the wedding? The name Charlotte made Oriana stiffen. The wine glass in her hand trembled, red liquid spilling over the rim. Why would you mention that place? She asked, her voice dropping into a threat. I smiled. The smile of a builder who had just discovered the fatal crack in a wall. Because I recently met an old friend of yours from there. He said you owe him an apology. And about $2 million. The atmosphere in the room collapsed instantly. Oriana's aristocratic mask vanished. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing like a trapped animal. Who do you think you are? You are nothing but a lowly builder. You have no right to question me. She snatched the check from the table. But at that exact moment, Kane stood up. He reached inside his collar and ripped the recording device free, dropping it directly onto Oriana's plate. It is over, Mom, Kane said. His voice now carried relief and strength. The FBI has heard everything. Oriana's face turned from red to ghostly pale. She stared at the tiny device, blinking with a red light. Then she looked around the room. The waiters who had been standing quietly suddenly moved closer. They were not waiters. They were undercover agents. Oriana jumped to her feet and rushed toward the back exit. But she stopped abruptly when someone stepped in from the bright doorway. It was not a police officer. It was a middle-aged man with a long scar across his forehead. The missing victim from Naples that Joe Russo had mentioned. The moment Oriana saw him, she let out a horrified cry, as if she had seen a ghost. They believed gray hair meant we had forgotten how to fight. But the truth did not end with an arrest. Another explosive secret about the real connection between this man, Oriana, and Kane was about to be revealed right there in the middle of the room. The man who stepped out of the shadows was Arthur. The victim everyone thought had disappeared in Naples. Oriana stepped backward. The color drained from her face. The expensive foundation on her skin could not hide the terror twisting through every muscle. She stumbled over a chair and collapsed onto the floor. Agents closed in. The metallic sound of handcuffs snapped through the room. Click. It is over, Oriana, I said. My voice was cold as steel. Did you really think you could bury everything under silk and luxury? Oriana showed no remorse. She glared at Kane with burning hatred. Traitor. I gave birth to you. I pulled you out of the mud. She screamed as the agents dragged her past the elegant dining tables. But Kane did not look back. He stood beside Emma. Their hands were tightly intertwined. For the first time in years, I saw his shoulders relax. The weight of slavery had finally been lifted. The trial lasted 11 months. It was a journey through darkness. Joe Russo worked without rest. He brought a long line of victims into the courtroom. Fathers with white hair. Families ruined by bankruptcy. Mothers who had lost their children to the cruelty of this woman. Oriana sat there in an orange prison uniform. No diamond anchor ring. No elegant speeches about Yale or Greenwich. She still tried to perform. She blamed circumstances. She blamed Kane. She claimed she was only a victim of a money-obsessed society. But numbers do not lie. The recordings from Kane's microphone exposed everything. Every fake invoice. Every plan to drain money from another family. Everything stood in the open like daylight. The final verdict left the courtroom silent. Oriana received 15 years in prison with no parole. Roger, the accomplice behind the shell accounts, received 12 years. When the judge struck the gavel, I saw a single tear slide down Kane's cheek. It was not pity, it was the relief of a soul finally escaping hell. It seemed like everything had finally ended. Justice had been served. The criminals had paid the price. But when we stepped outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and former victims embracing each other in tears, Arthur approached me. He handed me an old piece of paper that had been found in Oriana's archive. He looked at Kane, then back at me with a complicated expression. Silas, you should read this, Arthur whispered. This is why she kept Kane under control all these years. It is not only about the accident from years ago. I unfolded the paper. Crooked handwriting from more than 20 years ago appeared on the page. My breath caught in my throat. It was a secret about blood, a truth Kane himself had never known. A revelation that could completely redefine the meaning of family we had fought so hard to protect. Sometimes the greatest victory is not putting a criminal behind bars. Sometimes it is facing the truth about the people we love most. But would Emma and Kane still be able to move forward once this terrible truth came to light? I stood beneath the old oak tree in my yard. The evening breeze moved gently through the leaves. There were no elegant wine glasses clinking together. No unfamiliar guests from Paris or London. Only the laughter of a few close friends, and the smell of freshly cut grass. Emma stepped out wearing a simple white dress. It did not cost thousands of dollars, yet it shined brighter than anything Oriana had ever worn. The paper Arthur gave me still rested quietly in my jacket pocket. The secret about Cain being the real son of one of Oriana's first victims had finally been revealed. She had not only stolen his future, she had stolen his identity when he was still a child and raised him as a tool for her scams. I looked at Cain. He stood waiting for Emma beside the wooden arch I had built with my own hands. He knew the truth now, and he had chosen to face it. Their wedding happened quickly. The entire ceremony cost $520 for the paperwork and a few bundles of wildflowers. When the pastor pronounced them, husband and wife, Cain turned toward me. His eyes were wet. "Thank you, Dad," he said softly. He no longer called me Mr. Silas. He called me Pop. One simple word, but it carried the weight of 1,000. It was recognition. It was the beginning of a real family. I looked toward the horizon. The dark clouds from the trial had finally passed. Oriana sat behind prison bars. She still showed no remorse. In the letters she sent from prison, she continued blaming her son. She called it betrayal. I called it awakening. A con artist will never understand that love cannot be measured by the numbers written on a wedding budget. When the celebration began, I sat alone in an old armchair. I reflected on everything that had happened. We are often blinded by glamour. We fear being seen as lower class. That fear is the fertile ground where people like Oriana plant their seeds. But I learned something valuable. When someone reveals their true character at the dinner table, believe them the first time. Do not paint over their cruelty with excuses. I lifted a glass of lemonade. The sour and sweet were perfectly balanced. Emma and Cain danced together on the grass. They did not have $1 million in their account, but they had each other. They had the truth. And they had a father willing to fight to the very end to protect that truth. I looked toward the imaginary camera in front of me. There was something I wanted to tell you. Life does not always deliver dramatic reversals like the movies. But if you keep your feet firmly on the ground, you will never be swept away by artificial tides. If you followed the story all the way to this moment, you probably felt something for it. So please take one small second to help us. Subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing. And it means everything to us. The story of the fake Whitfield family has come to an end, but the lessons about trust and awareness will remain. My name is Silas, and this is how I reclaimed my daughter's life. But have you ever wondered how many other Orianas might still be sitting across from you at a Sunday lunch table? The next secret I will reveal, about another family of scammers, is even more chilling. Are you ready for the next plan? Wait for the story next week.